100 ground beef recipes vanished from American kitchens between the 1960s and now, and most of them disappeared the same way, quietly, when the woman who made them stopped cooking and nobody wrote anything down. Your mother had her meatloaf on Monday, a skillet of loose meat over rice on Tuesday, stuffed peppers by Wednesday, and hamburger gravy on toast when Friday rolled around. She did not need a recipe card. She needed a pound of ground beef and whatever was already sitting in the pantry. Those meals kept families fed when the grocery budget barely stretched past bread and milk. Some of them showed up at every church potluck in town. Some were so simple they never got written down, just passed along by watching your mother's hands at the stove. And some have quietly slipped out of American cooking because the women who made them are gone, and nobody thought to ask how. The classic roast beaver tail. Now, I know this one sounds a tad bit unusual right off the bat, but this meaty meal was once a cornerstone of survival for Native Americans and early settlers. Imagine this, trading a juicy steak for a flat, scaly beaver tail. But hey, survival is survival. They said it tasted like pork rinds, so maybe it wasn't as bad as it sounds. Beaver tails were roasted over an open flame until the skin was crisp and the fat underneath rendered down. Beavers were a crucial resource for Native American tribes, and they didn't let any part of the rodent go to waste, not even the tails. Roast beaver tail wasn't just sustenance. It was a delicacy among American Indians and trappers. The best part? It wasn't just finger-licking delicious, but also provided a high-energy meal for those braving the frontier. Today, it's almost entirely forgotten as chicken has taken over the dinner table. Elk roast was all the rage for Native American tribes. Elk is native to North America and parts of Asia, and people have relied on it as a food source for centuries. You know, back when cattle weren't common in the States. This roast was a favorite in regions where elk was abundant, and its sacred recipe was passed down from generation to generation. So, why was it such a hit back in the day? Well, apart from the tribe's sacred connections to the animal which made it a favorite, it was pretty easy to make too. It was often slow-cooked over hot coals. Think of it as modern-day barbecue, just without all the fancy grills and tools. Elk meat was replaced by more readily available options like beef and pork. It's a shame, really, because elk roast can be a delicious and healthy meal. Calico beans got their name from the coat of a calico cat. The way 3 or 4 kinds of beans and browned meat created a patchwork of colors in the baking dish that looked, if you squinted, like something that was actually pretty. Ground beef browned with bacon and onions, then combined with canned pork and beans, kidney beans, and butter beans in a sauce of ketchup, brown sugar, cider vinegar, and mustard, baked until it bubbled and thickened at the edges. By the 1960s, this dish was a fixture at church potlucks, summer cookouts, and county fair covered dish suppers from Wisconsin to Kansas. It stretched a half-pound of beef into something that fed 20 people and held heat for hours. Ideal for the long drive to the fairgrounds. You brought it in a cast-iron Dutch oven if you had one, a covered casserole if you didn't, and the pot came back empty every single time. These days, calico beans have slipped off the menu almost everywhere that isn't a Midwestern church basement, replaced by dishes that take more effort and feed fewer people with less warmth. If calico beans were the centerpiece of the Midwestern potluck table, shipwreck casserole earned its name in Midwestern kitchens where mothers layered whatever they had into a single baking dish and hoped for the best. Raw, sliced onions on the bottom, then potatoes, then crumbled ground beef, then rice, then canned tomatoes poured over everything like a blanket. The whole thing went into the oven at 350 degrees for nearly 2 hours, while the family went about their evening. No stirring, no checking, just patience and heat. Amish and Mennonite communities across Ohio and Indiana kept versions in their handwritten recipe collections for decades, sometimes calling it 7-layer dinner. The slow bake turned raw rice tender, melted the onions into sweetness, and let the tomato juice seep through every layer until the casserole became one deeply savory thing. A full dinner, protein, starch, vegetables, from one dish and about 70 cents worth of groceries. Number 29, hamburger corn pone pie. You browned ground beef with diced onion and stirred in a can of tomato sauce, a handful of chili powder, and a can of drained whole kernel corn. That went into a greased baking dish. On top, you spread a thick layer of cornbread batter, the kind made from yellow cornmeal, 1 egg, and a splash of milk. 25 minutes at 400 degrees, and the cornbread rose golden brown over a bubbling layer of spiced beef. It was a complete supper in one pan. The starch and the protein baked together, and the crust soaked up just enough juice to stay tender on the bottom while the top stayed dry and crumbly. Women in the rural South had been making versions of this since their grandmothers cooked over wood. Cabbage roll casserole was born from necessity, a way to capture all the comfort of stuffed cabbage without the time or patience it demanded. Housewives layered shredded cabbage with ground beef, rice, and tomato sauce in deep enamel pans, letting it bake slowly until the flavors melted together. The cabbage softened, the rice swelled, and the beef seasoned everything with richness far beyond its cost. The scent filled the home. Sweet cabbage, tangy tomato, and that unmistakable warmth of food meant to last for days. It was a dish of resourcefulness, created by people who could turn a single pound of meat into something that fed 6. Served steaming from the oven, it carried both nourishment and pride. Every spoonful tasted like a small victory over scarcity, like love stretched thin but still holding strong. In many homes, it was Sunday dinner and Monday lunch, its flavor deepening with each reheating. Though forgotten by most modern tables, cabbage roll casserole once stood as proof that a little imagination and a lot of care could transform thrift into comfort. Rag mop casserole was not just a recipe. It was a reflection of how weirdly wonderful American kitchens could be in the 1950s. Inspired by the popular novelty song of the same name, this dish felt like someone took everything comforting about a weeknight dinner and tossed it in a baking dish on a dare. It all started with ground beef, browned and seasoned in a skillet, then layered with canned spaghetti. You know, the kind drowning in that slightly sweet tomato sauce, and finished off with a cheesy breadcrumb topping that always ended up extra crispy. You could tell this came from a time when convenience and flavor had to shake hands in a hurry. Moms loved it because it used shelf-stable pantry staples. And in a lot of kitchens across small-town America, it was. But if you think that was comfort food turned up to 11, just wait until you hear about the next one, a dish that was practically designed to stretch $1 and fill a table. Mixing in oats instead of breadcrumbs was one of Grandma's thriftiest and most reliable tricks, and it worked better than most of us realize. Rolled oats blended right into ground beef without taking away from its flavor, and because they absorbed juices, the beef stayed moist instead of drying out. Oats also gave meatloaf and patties a lighter texture that felt more filling, which mattered when you were trying to stretch a single pound to feed an entire table. For families who grew up in leaner times, this clever substitution was about more than thrift. It was about making meals last. Oats were affordable, always in the pantry, and easy to work with, which made them the perfect stand-in when breadcrumbs weren't available. The beauty of this trick is how seamlessly it fit into daily cooking. Most people couldn't even tell oats were hidden inside. Today, it's often overlooked because modern recipes default to breadcrumbs. But in truth, oats gave those classic dishes their old-fashioned heartiness. It wasn't just about saving money, it was about getting the most out of what you had and never letting an ingredient go to waste, which was the very spirit of Grandma's kitchen. Hamburger gravy over mashed potatoes showed up on the table when the week had run long and the money had run short, and it still felt like Sunday. You browned the ground beef in cast iron, worked a spoonful of flour into the meat, added water or thin milk, and let it bubble into a dark, thick gravy, scraping every caramelized bit off the bottom of the pan because those bits were the whole flavor. During the Depression years, when ground beef ran about 12 cents a pound at the corner butcher, this dish stretched a single purchase across 2 or 3 suppers. The potatoes went down first, hand-mashed with butter, and the gravy found every edge. She's gone now, and nobody has made pan gravy from scratch in that kitchen since the day she stopped cooking. Beef fudge is almost everything it sounds like. It's a fascinating historical recipe that's almost a bit surprising to hear when you first learn about it. For the medieval period, though, it made a lot of sense. It's not really like the chocolate fudge sundaes we're used to today. Beef fudge was a wartime dish that used animal fat like tallow or ground beef that had been very finely made to make a sweet treat. Now, how did it do that? Well, they put in cocoa powder, sugar, blended the meat with honey and nuts, and had warm spices thrown in there, which were typically always used for more sweet dishes. In execution, it felt like a hybrid between the texture of a traditional fudge and the flavor notes of pemmican. Still, this dish didn't last. By the middle of the 20th century, sweetly flavored meat desserts just weren't doing well. It wasn't appealing, especially as people began to explore more and more of European and French cuisine, becoming obsessed with trying new wine-based wonders in their food. Eventually, beef fudge faded very much into obscurity, but it's definitely one of those things that's very interesting and fun to make every once in a while. The good thing about the fudge was that it could be made using whatever sweet flavors you would like. Hamburger spoon bread bake was a southern trick that turned two humble meals into one. You seasoned ground beef, poured cornbread batter over it, and baked it until it puffed and browned. The meat stayed juicy, the cornbread caught the drippings, and every bite was soft and satisfying. You served it with a spoon, never sliced. That was the charm. It was food for people who had worked all day and just wanted something warm. It was often made with leftover cornbread or box mix, paired with beef fried with onions and maybe some paprika or chili powder. Cheese? Sometimes. Vegetables? If they were around. It depended on what was in the pantry and who was coming over. Spoon bread bake was loved in small towns where casseroles mattered, and feeding more people with less was a way of life. It might not look like much, but it was as filling as a second helping of love. Before it made its comeback on social media, number 24, sardines on toast. You opened the flat tin, laid the little fish across a piece of buttered toast, squeezed a few drops of lemon juice if you had half a lemon in the refrigerator, and ate them with a fork. The sardines were salty, oily, and rich enough to fill you up on 2 slices of bread and nothing else. Some people mashed them with a fork and spread them flat like a paste. Others left them whole and ate each one in 2 careful bites. A tin of sardines could sit in the pantry for years without going bad, and when you finally cracked it open, dinner was ready before the kettle finished boiling. This was old country food, the kind of supper that Portuguese and Italian grandparents brought over and never stopped making. Simple, fast, and filling enough to carry you through the night on pocket change. Poor man's stroganoff brought a touch of elegance to modest kitchens without the expensive cuts of beef that traditional recipes demanded. Ground beef was browned with onions until fragrant, then combined with cream of mushroom soup straight from the can, a convenience that made this dish accessible to seniors who found elaborate cooking exhausting. Sour cream was stirred in at the end, creating a tangy richness that elevated the humble ingredients. The mixture was served over egg noodles cooked soft, the creamy sauce clinging to every strand. For seniors in the 1960s and 1970s, this recipe proved that budget cooking didn't mean sacrificing flavor or dignity. A single pound of ground beef could provide leftovers for several dinners when cooking for one. The dish appeared at potlucks and church suppers, where widows and widowers shared their versions, comparing notes on whether to add paprika or mushroom pieces. It was comfort food that carried memories of better times. Beef and potato hash was the weeknight miracle that turned yesterday's potatoes into tonight's hearty supper. Grandmothers would dice leftover boiled potatoes and fry them in bacon grease until the edges crisped golden brown, then crumble in ground beef seasoned with salt, pepper, and a shake of paprika. The mixture sizzled together in cast iron skillets until the beef browned and the potatoes absorbed those savory drippings. Onions went in early, softening and sweetening as they cooked down. This wasn't fancy food. It was survival food that tasted like home. Families of 6 could eat well on a pound of meat when it was stretched with cheap potatoes from the root cellar. Fathers came home from factory shifts to find this waiting on the table. Children grew up associating that smell of crisping potatoes and browning beef with security itself. Nothing was measured, nothing written down, yet it came out perfect every single time. Jellied eels were a staple on the dinner table back in the 1900s. This dish was whipped up in London in the 18th century, when a bored chef decided to mix things up a bit. Here's the thing. Eels were dirt cheap back in the day, so they were everyone's favorite source of meat. The dish consisted of chopped eels boiled in a spiced stock and allowed to cool and set, forming a jelly. It was usually served cold and made a good substitute for dessert. Since it was light on the pockets, the English loved to serve it at dinner parties and festivals. It also made its way out to other parts of Europe, such as Denmark and Sweden, which came up with their own versions of the jelly. You won't find a lot of people talking about jellied eels now, because it has largely disappeared from the British menus. But hey, if you're ever feeling adventurous enough, I say give this one a try. Pickled beef tongue was a classic back in the day. Some love it, others not so much. Now, before you jump to any conclusions, just hear me out because it's not as bizarre as it sounds. Yeah, beef tongue was found in many national cuisines and was used for taco fillings in Mexico and for open-faced sandwiches in the United Kingdom. Beef tongue, whether braised or pickled, was a versatile dish served both hot and cold. Believe it or not, it was a staple back in the day. It actually tastes pretty good if you close your eyes and pretend you're not eating beef tongue, because that can sound a tad bit too much. It's not the healthiest meat though, because beef tongue is very high in fat, which contributes up to 72% of its caloric content. It has become rare today, but you will be surprised to see how many places still sell beef tongue burritos down in Mexico. Yikes! The loose meat sandwich was what Iowa built its food identity around. And if you called it a sloppy Joe within earshot of someone from Sioux City, you would hear about it. The story starts in 1924, when Dave Heglin began selling seasoned, loose ground beef at Ye Old Tavern in Sioux City. No patty, no sauce, scooped onto a steamed bun with mustard, pickles, and onion. 2 years later, butcher Fred Angel opened the first Maid-Rite in Muscatine, steaming his beef in a proprietary dark liquid and letting the crumbly, juicy result spread through Iowa with the persistence of something that knows exactly what it is. You ate it leaning over the counter because it fell apart the moment you picked it up. And that was not a flaw. That was the point. 2 distinct tastes in every bite, the old-timers said, and neither translated to any other preparation. The woman who drove 40 minutes out of her way to stop at the Marshalltown Maid-Rite on every road trip took that habit with her, and the children she raised elsewhere grew up without it. Bisquick Impossible Cheeseburger Pie was the magic trick that launched 1,000 weeknight dinners. The recipe first appeared on the back of the Bisquick box around 1971, and Betty Crocker promoted it through her recipe card library that same year. The impossible part was the selling point. You poured a batter of Bisquick, milk, and eggs over seasoned ground beef and shredded cheddar in a pie plate, and the batter sank during baking to form its own crust. No rolling, no crimping, no pastry skills required. The filling was straightforward: browned ground beef with diced onion, a splash of Worcestershire sauce, salt and pepper. But topped with that self-forming golden crust and bubbling cheese, it looked like something that took real effort. At around 40 cents for the Bisquick and 60 cents for the beef, the whole pie cost barely over $1. It became the answer to what to make when company was coming, and there was nothing in the house but hamburger. What do you do when you need to feed 12 people on $1's worth of meat? Number 28. Spanish rice with ground beef. You browned a pound of ground beef with chopped onion and green pepper, drained the grease, then added a can of tomato sauce, a cup of uncooked rice, 2 cups of water, and a heavy shake of cumin and garlic powder. You covered the skillet and let it simmer for 20 minutes until the rice absorbed everything. The finished dish was brick red and fragrant, sticky enough to eat with a fork, and filling enough that nobody asked for seconds because there were none. Every family in the Southwest had their own version, and they all tasted like Wednesday night. The green pepper was the tell. If you could smell green pepper cooking from the sidewalk, you knew somebody in that house was making Spanish rice. Depression-era cabbage soup was survival in a pot. It began with water, not stock, and whatever scraps the week had left behind. A ham bone, a heel of onion, a wilted carrot. Cabbage went in by the handful, sliced thin to cook down soft, its sweetness turning broth into something more than it was. Ground beef or sausage might stretch across several meals, browned just enough to flavor the pot, before being set aside for tomorrow. People called it soup, but it was more like resilience simmered on the stove. It filled the belly, warmed cold hands, and kept families fed through long winters when the pantry shelves were bare. The taste was humble, peppery, cabbage sweet, sometimes smoky if luck allowed, and yet no one complained. In those days, waste was unthinkable, and gratitude was constant. That pot of cabbage soup was not just dinner, it was hope you could eat. Ground beef and potato hash was the weak beef birds, sometimes called mock steak rolls, were the kind of food that made you feel like you were having a fancy dinner, even if the meat came from the budget bin. The idea was simple but genius. Take seasoned ground beef, flatten it out like you are making an edible canvas, roll it up with stuffing or sometimes chopped onions inside, then tie or skewer it like it is some French roast on Sunday dinner. These little bundles were browned in a pan and sometimes finished in gravy, soaking up every bit of flavor like they had been waiting all day for it. The texture was soft, the taste was rich, and the presentation, well, that part made you feel like you were dining at a place that had real cloth napkins. They were a perfect disguise for humble ingredients. And just when you think the American kitchen could not get more inventive, along came a dish that turned ground beef into a noodle-topped flavor bomb with a crunchy surprise. Stretching with mashed potatoes was another clever way Grandma turned a little beef into a lot of dinner. Whenever there were leftovers sitting in the fridge, she didn't let them go unused. Instead, she folded the mashed potatoes directly into ground beef. The result was a creamy, hearty mixture that could be shaped into patties, baked into casseroles, or fried into crisp cakes that still tasted rich and filling. Potatoes not only extended the beef, but also added a silky texture that breadcrumbs or flour couldn't match. It was comfort food through and through, with a flavor that spoke to both frugality and warmth. Families who grew up on potato-stretched beef never forgot the way it felt to eat something so satisfying, even when times were lean. This wasn't a compromise, it was a form of creativity that made each bite taste more substantial. Instead of thinking about what was missing, you thought about how clever the dish was, how it filled the belly, and how Grandma always seemed to know how to make just enough food for everyone. These days, we often discard leftovers or reach for more meat, but the potato trick proves a pound could go further than you thought. Porcupine meatballs looked like something a child imagined and a grandmother made real. You mixed raw long-grain rice directly into the raw ground beef, no pre-cooking, no soaking, along with diced onion, salt, and black pepper, and rolled the mixture into balls about the size of a golf ball. The uncooked rice was the trick. It swelled as it simmered, pushing outward through the meat into the quills that gave the dish its name. Into a pot of tomato sauce they went, lid on tight, 45 minutes over the lowest flame. The rice cooked inside the meatball from the beef's heat while the sauce worked its way in from outside, and by the time the lid came off, every grain had absorbed flavor from both directions at once. By the 1940s, porcupine meatballs appeared regularly in church community cookbooks from Pennsylvania to Oregon as a reliable way to stretch half a pound of ground beef into a full supper for 4 people. Nobody younger than 60 seems to know what they are. The recipe is still in the box, written in pencil on an index card that's starting to fade. Banana meatloaf is an incredibly practical recipe that emerged from times where frugality was almost as much of a virtue as cleanliness. Rationing, resourcefulness, and economic hardship were how everyone was getting by. And this was only more true during the worst parts of the Great Depression and World War II. Home cooks were forced to work with very few ingredients, and the typical banana meatloaf recipe was something that was very bare bones and required little prep work or elaborate lists of ingredients to create. All you needed for this was pork mixed with mashed ripe bananas. Throw in some breadcrumbs, which could be repurposed from stale bread, onions, which most people were already stocking up on or growing, and basic seasonings like pepper, nutmeg, and salt, and you had yourself a pretty all-right dish. The banana worked as a binder and a natural sweetener, and it would often work really well with Worcestershire sauce, believe it or not. It helped balance out the incredible sweetness of ripe bananas. This dish did particularly well in Hawaii, where it was appreciated for blending in with already existing preferences. Cowboy pie was rough and hearty. Ground beef, baked beans, and a biscuit topping that crisped up in the oven just enough to hold everything together. There were no cowboys involved, but it felt like something a hungry ranch hand would love. It was warm, it was messy, and it filled you right up. The base was usually ground beef cooked down with onions, and sometimes a little barbecue sauce or ketchup, then a layer of baked beans, canned of course, and a topping of drop biscuits or biscuit dough from a box. When it came out of the oven, it was golden and bubbling and maybe a little lopsided. No one cared. It was dependable. You served it with a spoon straight from the pan and hoped there was enough left for seconds. The kind you made when the pantry was running low but dinner still had to happen. And somehow, it always hit the spot. The name alone made kids raise their eyebrows, but once they tasted it, they stopped asking. Number 21. Vienna sausages and pork and beans. You opened both cans, sliced the little sausages in half lengthwise, and heated everything together in the same saucepan. That was the recipe, the whole recipe. The Vienna sausages added a salty, soft protein to the sweet and smoky beans, and together they made a meal that sat heavy enough in your stomach to get you through the night. Eaten with a piece of cornbread or a few saltine crackers, this was supper for one on a pension check night when you did not feel like standing in front of the stove any longer than you had to. The saucepan went from shelf to burner to bowl in about 4 minutes. You could eat and be washing the dish before the evening news started. Quick, quiet, and done. There was a time when the canned meat aisle was the most important row in the grocery store, not the produce section, not the bakery. The aisle with the short, heavy cans lined up like ammunition. For seniors living on a fixed income, that aisle was the difference between eating and not eating. A can of Spam could sit on the shelf for years. It did not spoil. It did not need refrigeration. It did not go bad if the power went out. And when the Social Security check came a day late or the heating bill ate into the grocery money, those cans were still right there on the shelf waiting. Nobody wrote a cookbook about canned meat dinners. Nobody had to. The recipes lived in muscle memory, passed from kitchen to kitchen, hand to hand. Spanish rice with beef brought color and warmth to tables during decades when exotic flavors meant anything beyond salt and pepper. Ground beef was browned with onions and green peppers until the vegetables softened. Then rice was added along with canned tomatoes, water, and seasonings like chili powder and cumin. The mixture simmered covered until the rice absorbed all the liquid, turning fluffy and fragrant with each grain tinted orange from the tomatoes. For seniors living alone, this one skillet meal meant dinner and tomorrow's lunch from a single cooking session. The recipe was forgiving. A little more water if the rice seemed dry, a little longer cooking if needed. The dish appeared in countless community cookbooks throughout the South and Southwest, where frugal cooks understood that ground beef stretched furthest when surrounded by vegetables and grains. Each forkful delivered protein, vegetables, and starch in perfect balance, a complete meal that cost pennies per serving. Hamburger gravy poured over biscuits was the meal that made empty pantries feel abundant. Ground beef was browned in a skillet, then flour was sprinkled over the meat and stirred until it coated everything evenly. Milk went in slowly, stirred constantly until the mixture thickened into rich, creamy gravy studded with seasoned beef. The gravy was ladled generously over split biscuits baked fresh or pulled from yesterday's batch. Salt and pepper were the only seasonings needed, though some grandmothers added a dash of sage. This dish cost pennies, yet delivered satisfaction that expensive meals couldn't match. It was breakfast, lunch, and dinner, depending on the day. Farm families ate it before dawn chores, while city families stretched it across weeknight suppers. The gravy could be thinned with more milk to feed extra mouths when company arrived. Children scraped their plates clean while parents exchanged knowing glances about the budget. Pressed duck, a French-inspired masterpiece, is just as complex as it sounds. The dish involves cooking a duck and then using a special press to extract the blood and juices, which are then used to create a rich, flavorful sauce. You heard that right? A sauce made out of blood and bone marrow. Now, before you wrinkle your nose, this dish was a showstopper at French restaurants back in the day, and its unique taste spoke for itself. The complex dish was a specialty of Rouen, and its creation was attributed to an innkeeper from the city of Duclair. It's also known as canard à la presse and is a specialty of the Tour d'Argent restaurant in Paris. Cooking pressed duck isn't a job for the weak and requires special time and effort, which is exactly why it has become a rare dinner time on our tables now. And then, of course, not everyone has a knack for eating a sauce made out of bone marrow. While we're on the topic of bizarre, meaty meals, hog's head cheese is another crazy one on the list. Now, don't let the name confuse you because the meal doesn't contain any cheese or in fact any dairy products at all. It is made with flesh from the head of a pig, typically set in aspic and usually eaten cold, at room temperature, or in a sandwich. The parts of the head used do not commonly include the brain, eyes, or ears, but everything else? It's all in there somewhere. This unique meat jelly originated somewhere in ancient Germany and instantly made its way to other parts of Europe. Many recipes use a bit of lemon juice to add a bit more flavor to the jelly. It's not a part of our dinner tables anymore, and I don't know about you, but a lot of people want to keep it this way. Hamburger soup was what happened on the days when there wasn't quite enough of anything. A half-pound of ground beef browned with onions, then whatever the garden was giving up or the icebox needed to clear, potatoes, carrots, celery, green beans, a can of tomatoes, added with enough water to cover everything and left to simmer on the back burner all afternoon. The broth thickened from the potato starch. The beef broke into smaller pieces until it spread through every spoonful, and by supper time the kitchen smelled like it had been cooking all day, because it had. There was no recipe. The recipe was the pot, the heat and whatever needed using up, salt, pepper, sometimes a bay leaf. By the 1950s, this soup still showed up every time the week got long and the refrigerator got thin, not because money was short, but because the instinct to make something from almost nothing had been practiced so long it felt like knowledge. She made it without measuring, without looking at anything but the pot. The version you make from a recipe never tastes like the version she made from a Tuesday. Before it became cafeteria food, Johnny Marzetti had a proper origin story. Teresa Marzetti, who ran a restaurant near Ohio State University in Columbus, created the dish in the early 20th century and named it after her brother-in-law. By the 1970s, the recipe had migrated so far from its restaurant roots that most people just called it that noodle casserole. The formula was ground beef browned with onions and green peppers, stirred into cooked elbow macaroni with canned tomato sauce, then topped with shredded American cheese and baked until bubbling. School cafeterias across Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan served it by the tray, and PTA cookbooks listed it more often than almost any other main dish. What set it apart from generic hamburger noodle bakes was the green pepper. That slightly bitter crunch against soft noodles and rich meat sauce gave it a character plain casseroles lacked. At roughly 12 cents a serving in a school kitchen, it fed hundreds of children daily. Number 26. Pizza burgers. You browned ground beef and stirred in a small can of tomato paste, a teaspoon of oregano, garlic powder, and a pinch of sugar. You spooned the mixture onto split hamburger buns, laid a slice of mozzarella on each one, and ran them under the broiler until the cheese bubbled and browned at the edges. Kids went wild for these because they tasted like pizza, but looked like something from a diner. A pound of beef made 8 open-face halves, which meant a family of 4 ate for the price of a single frozen pizza and had leftovers. The sugar in the tomato paste was the trick. It cut the acid and made the sauce taste rounder, almost sweet, exactly the way delivery pizza tasted. Final meal. Everything left over fried together until golden and good. Cold potatoes were diced, onions chopped, and ground beef stirred in, sizzling in bacon grease until the edges crisped. The sound alone could make a kitchen feel alive again. It was working people's food, simple and sustaining. The kind of meal that made no apologies for being plain because it did not have to. Served hot from cast iron, it was eaten with ketchup, pickles, or whatever condiment the cupboard still had. In some homes, an egg might crown the top, a small luxury that made it feel like something more. Families called it hash, but it was really a story of thrift, of making beauty from what remained. Every bite carried the smoky taste of labor and care, the warmth of food cooked slow and shared fast. Sloppy Joe pie was what happened when someone decided that sloppy joes deserved a throne. You started with the classic filling, ground beef, tomato sauce or ketchup, a hint of mustard or Worcestershire if you were feeling adventurous, all simmered until it thickened into that perfect sweet, savory sloppy joe consistency. But instead of sandwiching it in a soft bun, you would pour it into a casserole dish and crown it with a golden biscuit crust. Sometimes it was homemade dough, sometimes it was straight from a can, but it always rose into a fluffy, buttery topping that made the whole dish feel complete. Some versions used cornbread instead, which gave it a southern twist with just the right amount of sweetness. And even though it was born in a time when ground beef ruled the dinner table, Sloppy Joe pie had enough personality to still turn heads today. But if you thought ground beef had done it all, just wait until you meet the recipe that turned soda pop into secret sauce. Adding grated carrots or zucchini into ground beef was a quiet, clever trick that served multiple purposes in Grandma's kitchen. It wasn't only about making the beef stretch further, though that was a big part of it. It was also about slipping in extra nutrition without anyone noticing. Carrots added a natural sweetness that balanced savory flavors, while zucchini added moisture that kept burgers, meatloaf, or casseroles from drying out. Grating the vegetables fine meant they disappeared right into the beef, and kids usually had no idea they were eating vegetables at all. In a time when every ingredient had to be used wisely, this method made sense because it extended protein portions and made meals healthier at the same time. It also gave the beef more body and volume, turning one meal into two without anyone feeling shortchanged. This trick carried a sense of care, because Grandma knew how to make meals nourishing as well as filling. Today, with rising costs and an emphasis on hidden veggies, this old idea feels surprisingly modern. It's a reminder that cleverness in cooking was never about fancy ingredients, but about small adjustments that turned the ordinary into something bigger and better than expected. Poor man's steak was never actually steak, and anyone who made it knew that. But the name was the point. You combined ground beef with crushed saltine crackers and a splash of water, pressed it into a baking pan until it was about an inch thick, covered it, and put it in the refrigerator overnight. The next morning, you cut it into 3-inch squares, dredged each piece in flour, seared them golden in a hot skillet, then transferred everything to a roasting pan, poured undiluted cream of mushroom soup straight over the top, and baked it low and slow for a full hour. The saltines held moisture in instead of letting it cook out, a technique from Amish and Pennsylvania Dutch country kitchens, documented in Mennonite community cookbooks since at least the 1930s, leaving patties that were tender all the way through and a gravy that required no additional effort. Families in Appalachian communities and across the rural Midwest made this dish through the Depression and into the 1950s without once thinking of it as poor food. They called it a square meal. That distinction mattered to them. It should still matter. In the 1960s, there was a rising demand for all sorts of experimentative casserole recipes. One of those happened to beef and peanut butter casseroles, and before you exit the video, hear me out. Beef and peanut butter casserole is a fascinating example of how people can get really creative when the stakes are high. This is a dish that has its roots in Great Depression thrifting and ingenuity. If you think it sounds really unusual, you're right, but you're also probably only thinking about this from a flavor perspective instead of what it can do for your body. Most people realized that the protein potential of this was off the charts. It combined peanut butter, which was already carrying loads of the stuff with beef, and it was a meal that could be stretched out to feed an entire family. Plus, despite how we regularly associate peanut butter with sweeter confections, it's actually been something that's constantly thrown into savory recipes too. This was a casserole that emerged all the way in the 1930s or 1940s, but peaked in the 60s. And this was because it was only in those early decades that peanut butter even began to be commonly available in most people's homes. It's got a lot in common with some Thai peanut beef dishes too. Beef and tater tot hot dish was already a legend in Midwest kitchens. You browned your ground beef with onion, layered it in a casserole dish, topped it with a can of cream soup, mushroom, celery, chicken, and crowned it with frozen tater tots. Then you baked it until it bubbled. The tots crisped up. The meat stayed saucy, And the whole house smelled like a snow day with nothing else to do but eat. It was cheap, easy, and had everything: protein, carbs, salt, and memory. This dish was never about nutrition. It was about morale. It showed up at church dinners, weeknights, and holiday leftovers. It was a blank canvas, too. Add corn, peas, cheese, whatever needed using. The best versions were a little sloppy, with crisp edges and soft centers. The first scoop might burn your tongue, but no one waited. It was casserole as comfort, and it worked. A meal that made you forget the weather, the bills, and the stress, just for a minute. Number 23, tuna noodle casserole. This showed up at every church supper, every potluck, and every kitchen table where someone needed to feed 4 mouths and had about $2 to work with. You cooked the egg noodles, drained them, and mixed in a can of chunk-light tuna, a can of cream of mushroom soup, and a handful of frozen peas if you had them. Poured the whole thing into a baking dish, crushed saltine crackers on top, and slid it into the oven until it bubbled. The tuna was the cheapest protein in the store, not the fancy white albacore. The chunk light packed in oil, those flat little cans that cost less than a candy bar. Seniors who lived through the lean years knew this casserole by heart. No measuring, no timing, no skill beyond the ability to open cans and boil water. It came out golden on top and creamy underneath, and it tasted like somebody cared enough to try. That mattered more than most people think. Cheeseburger pie turned the familiar flavors of a beloved sandwich into something that could be sliced and served from a baking dish. Ground beef was browned with onions, seasoned simply, then spread into the bottom of a pie plate. A batter made from biscuit mix, eggs, and milk was poured over the top, and cheese was sprinkled generously before baking until golden and puffed. The result was a meal where the meat formed a savory base beneath a bread-like crust that absorbed all the delicious juices. For seniors cooking alone in the 1970s and 1980s, this dish offered the satisfaction of a cheeseburger without the fuss of grilling. Leftovers reheated beautifully, the cheese melting again into stringy perfection with each warming. The recipe spread through women's magazines and church cookbooks, praised for its simplicity and ability to please even picky grandchildren during weekend visits. One pie fed 4 easily, or stretched across several days of solo meals. Beef and noodle casserole was the covered dish that showed up at every church potluck and neighborhood gathering. Ground beef was browned with onions, combined with egg noodles and canned cream of mushroom soup, then baked until bubbling and golden on top. The soup created a creamy sauce that held everything together while the noodles absorbed those beefy flavors. Crushed potato chips or buttered breadcrumbs went on top for crunch, turning a simple casserole into something children fought over. This was the dish grandmothers made when feeding a crowd or when grieving families needed meals delivered. The casserole traveled well in foil-covered pans and reheated without losing its appeal. 1 pound of beef stretched to serve 12 when the noodles and soup did their work. Families relied on it for weeknight suppers assembled in minutes. The recipe existed only in memory, adjusted each time based on what the pantry held. Straight out of the royal family's dinner table, beef Wellington was a beef steak dish with the perfect regal twist. This delicacy was made of a tender beef fillet coated with pâté and duxelles, then wrapped in puff pastry, which made it just as fancy as it sounds. It was traditionally served with a rich red wine sauce, such as a Madeira or Cabernet Sauvignon reduction. Now, the origin of this meal is shrouded in history, but it is suggested that it emerged in England in the 19th century and was named after the Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley. This steak required a lot of time and patience, which made it a meal for only the royals of England. It's a part of ancient history now, but you might be able to taste it if you make your way to Regal Balls or a Michelin star restaurant in London. Can you imagine Thanksgiving without your grandma's famous turkey roast? Well, back in the day, roast goose was the traditional holiday dish. It was cooked using dry heat with hot air enveloping it evenly on all sides. Now, this is a dish I can get behind. Juicy, crispy skin, tender meat, and a flavorful stuffing. What's not to love? This dish was normally served with plum sauce to augment its flavor. It was particularly popular in England, where it was often served with applesauce and bread sauce instead. In Guangdong and Hong Kong, roast goose was a variety of siu mei, or roasted meat dishes, within Cantonese cuisine. It was made by roasting geese with seasoning, often in a charcoal furnace at high temperatures. This dinner isn't common anymore, but with a little effort, you can still find fresh goose and recreate this classic dish at home. Perhaps it's time to give the good old goose a chance to shine again. The miners who ate slumgullion in the California gold rush camps of the 1850s probably didn't enjoy it much. The name, from words meaning slime and cesspool, wasn't meant to flatter. But the idea behind it, a flexible stew of whatever meat, vegetables, and starches were on hand, simmered together until they became more than their parts, traveled through every lean decade, and arrived in Depression-era kitchens as a genuine weeknight staple. Ground beef browned with onion, mixed with canned corn and tomatoes and crackers or pasta, simmered until the crackers dissolved into the broth and thickened it from the inside. Every family had a different name for it. Some called it goulash, some slumgullion, some just called it supper. One woman who learned it in the middle 1930s remembered it being made with bacon and very little hamburger. Better the next day after the flavors blended. You didn't measure it, you didn't follow steps. The ability to walk up to an open refrigerator and see a meal was what it taught. It faded when pantries got fuller and the urgency went with them. Porcupine meatballs were a Tuesday night staple that children either loved or dreaded. The name came from raw rice mixed into the ground beef before shaping. The grains poked out in tiny white spikes after simmering in tomato sauce, giving each meatball the look of a tiny, edible porcupine. The recipe survived from the Depression, when mixing rice into meat was survival rather than whimsy. But by the early 1970s, it belonged to frugal cooks who knew a cup of rice could turn 1 pound of hamburger into enough meatballs for 6. Combine the beef with rice, egg, chopped onion, salt, and pepper. Roll into balls, brown in a skillet, then nestle them into canned tomato soup thinned with water. Covered and simmered for 45 minutes, the rice swelled, the meat stayed tender, and the sauce thickened into something rich and deeply tomatoey. Number 27. Poor man's steak. You mixed a pound of ground beef with crushed saltine crackers, 1 egg, salt, pepper, and a little milk until it held together like dough. Then you shaped it into oval patties about 1/2 inch thick and dredged them in flour. You browned them in a hot skillet, set them aside, and made gravy in the same pan with the drippings, more flour, and milk. The patties went back in and simmered in that gravy for 20 minutes. It tasted close enough to chicken fried steak that nobody at the table felt poor. The crackers were doing the heavy lifting, stretching a pound of meat into 6 patties instead of 4, and the gravy hid any difference. That was the whole point. Cabbage and noodles, Pulaski style, was comfort born in coal country. It came from immigrant kitchens where butter, onions, and cabbage were fried together until caramelized, then tossed with noodles and bits of ground beef. The result was smoky, soft, and faintly sweet, a dish that felt like warmth itself. It was cheap to make, easy to love, and could feed a crowd for pennies. In Pennsylvania, mining towns, and Midwest kitchens, Pulaski became more than a meal. It was memory on a plate. The sizzle of cabbage hitting butter, the smell of onions browning in old cast iron carried a rhythm of tradition. Even without meat, it was satisfying. With it, it became a small feast. Served in big enamel bowls, it spoke of perseverance, of families who worked hard, prayed often, and found joy wherever they could. Chow mein hot dish was a Midwestern potluck legend. It walked into the room carrying the scent of soy sauce and sizzling beef and left behind nothing but an empty casserole dish and a few requests for the recipe. Born sometime between post-war optimism and the suburban casserole boom, this dish took inspiration from Chinese-American takeout and made it its own. Ground beef was browned with chopped onions and celery, then mixed with a savory sauce, usually soy sauce and a can of cream of mushroom soup. That combination might sound odd, but it made everything come together with a velvety, umami-heavy punch. But the real fun started when you dumped a whole can of crunchy chow mein noodles right on top before baking. But if that flavor combination sounds bold, buckle up, because the next dish on this forgotten road trip adds soda to the skillet and somehow makes it work. Binding with evaporated milk was one of those subtle secrets that most people never realized was happening behind the scenes. Canned milk was a pantry staple, always on hand when fresh milk couldn't be counted on, and Grandma knew exactly how to use it to improve ground beef. Adding just a splash into meatloaf or burger mixtures gave the beef a tenderness it wouldn't have otherwise. It softened the texture, made it more cohesive, and added a richness that made the dish taste like more than the sum of its parts. The slightly concentrated flavor of evaporated milk also enhanced seasonings, blending them through the meat in a way that felt balanced and smooth. For many households, it was an invisible step that made the difference between a dense, heavy loaf and one that cut easily and stayed moist. This was a time when nothing in the pantry went ignored, and canned milk was versatile enough to become a secret weapon in savory as well as sweet cooking. Today, we pass by evaporated milk without thinking, but in Grandma's kitchen, it was part of the quiet magic that made ground beef meals taste better than you remembered. American chop suey was what New England called it, slumgullion in Maine, Johnny Marzetti in Ohio, American goulash everywhere else. But whatever you called it, you recognized the smell the moment the onion hit the pan. Ground beef browned with onion, elbow macaroni added dry, canned tomatoes and water poured over, the lid on and the flame turned low until the pasta had absorbed most of the liquid and the beef had dissolved into every bite. It's documented as far back as 1938 in Northeast cookbooks, shaped by Italian-American one-pot cooking and the Depression need for something filling and cheap. Campbell's tomato soup became the 1950s shortcut, and nobody was embarrassed about it. What's been lost isn't the recipe. It's the smell of it on a Tuesday evening in a small kitchen, filling the whole apartment with the certainty that the week was going to be all right. Stuffed prune meatballs are a really good example of sweet savory cooking. This was something you would see commonly throughout both Europe and America, and that was doubly true if we're talking about the 19th and 20th centuries. This was a dish that was a mix of prunes with one of 3 different kinds of meats. People would either use beef, pork, or veal. And after the meat had been softened to the point it could be shaped and pressed into a meatball, prunes would be stuffed inside them. Some people were a bit freakier than others and would shove an entire prune up there, but some would chop it first. While this might seem like an innovative idea, it's actually not all that new. Dried fruit and meat combinations, especially sweet and savory ones, are really old ideas. They go back all the way to several different cultures present in Europe. You'll find them in Scandinavian, British, Jewish, and German cultures, and if you go on over to Asia, you will still find many sweet and savory combinations. This was a dish that did really well in the 20th century, especially whenever there were Jewish holidays, but over time, the American palate started to settle down with what was familiar instead of stuff like this. It couldn't really last and compete with regular meatballs. Mock Swiss steak with ground beef was not fooling anyone, but no one minded. The original called for a real steak pounded flat and simmered in tomato gravy. The ground beef version skipped all that and made a patty. You browned it in a skillet, poured canned tomatoes over it, added onions, and let it simmer. The result was part burger, part meatloaf. It was soft, it was salty, it was cheap and dependable. In homes where steak was not on the menu, this was how you pretended. People served it with mashed potatoes or egg noodles, maybe a slice of white bread for the gravy. A pound of ground beef could stretch far if you shaped it right. This recipe showed up in many cookbooks from the 1960s and 1970s. It had different names: mock steak, gravy patties, poor man's steak, but the idea stayed. Make something that felt like more than it was. The kind of dinner that said, "This will do," and really meant it. Number 22. Corned beef hash. Open the can, dump the hash into a skillet, press it flat with a spatula, and let the bottom crust up for about 5 minutes without touching it. That crust was the whole point. Without it, you had warm mush. With it, you had something that crunched when the fork went through. Some people cracked an egg on top and covered the skillet to let it steam. Others ate it plain with ketchup and a piece of white bread. A can of corned beef hash from the grocery store was one of the cheapest hot dinners you could put together in under 10 minutes. You did not need to add a thing to it. Open, fry, eat. 3 steps, no leftovers. Burger steak with onion gravy elevated a simple beef patty into a proper dinner worthy of the dining table. Ground beef was shaped into thick oval patties, seasoned generously, then pan-fried in a cast-iron skillet until browned on both sides but still juicy inside. The patties were removed while sliced onions were cooked in the remaining fat until golden and soft, then flour was sprinkled over to create the base for gravy. Broth or water transformed the mixture into rich brown gravy that was poured over the patties and simmered until everything melded together. For seniors who remembered when eating out meant white tablecloths and proper service, this dish brought restaurant dignity to the home kitchen. The gravy stretched a small amount of meat into a filling meal, especially when served alongside mashed potatoes that soaked up every drop. This recipe survived because it made ordinary ground beef feel like a special occasion. Shepherd's pie without the lamb was how American grandmothers adapted the British classic to budgets and tastes. Ground beef was browned with onions and mixed with whatever vegetables were available: peas, carrots, corn, green beans, then spread in a baking dish and topped with mashed potatoes. The whole thing baked until the potatoes turned golden brown and the filling bubbled up around the edges. Grandmothers made this when they needed one dish to serve as the entire meal, complete with meat, vegetables, and starch. The mashed potato topping could be piped fancy for company or simply spread with a fork for Tuesday supper. Families ate it straight from the baking dish, scooping portions that included every layer. The dish used up leftover mashed potatoes and any vegetables that needed cooking. 1 pound of beef beneath all those potatoes and vegetables fed 8 people satisfied. This was the cooking of women who never wasted anything. Before chicken became everyone's favorite pie stuffing, rabbit pie was a favorite on the Easter table. Made out of tender rabbit meal, this savory pie was a household favorite in many rural areas. Rabbit meat is not only rich in flavor, but it's full of nutrients, which made this a healthy choice for many and a staple of the American pioneers. Plus, rabbit meat didn't cost a fortune like most meat back in the day and was widely available. Along with rabbit meat, ingredients of the filling of a rabbit pie typically included onions, celery, and carrots. Some English variations included prunes, bacon, and cider, while the Australians sometimes included the food paste Vegemite. Rabbits aren't as common as they were back then, so rabbit pie has vanished from our tables and Easter traditions. You know what? All good things come to an end. Sheep's head stew. Now, this is where things get a bit adventurous. This dish, once a staple in many cultures, involves cooking the entire head of a sheep, including the brain, eyes, and tongue. Yes, including. This one is a Scottish delicacy, also known as powsowdy, and was whipped up in Edinburgh, Scotland. Don't confuse it with the other powsowdy, which is a term for milk and meal boiled together. Dried peas and barley are other common ingredients used in this meaty dish. Sheep's head stew was often enjoyed in rural areas where nothing went to waste. Skinning the head and preparing it for the stew is a time-consuming task, and it can get messier, but if you manage to pull this one off, it is definitely worth getting your hands dirtier than usual. Hamburger cornbread bake showed up in the 1940s as a direct result of wartime arithmetic. Beef was rationed, cornmeal was not. Ground beef browned with onion and seasoned simply, salt, pepper, a can of creamed corn stirred in for moisture, spread into a cast-iron skillet, then covered with a poured cornbread batter slightly looser than usual, thin enough to flow around the edges and seal the meat underneath. In the oven, the batter puffed and browned into a crust that absorbed the fat and juices rising from below, so the bottom of the cornbread was savory in a way the top never was. You served it by scooping rather than slicing, the crust breaking apart over the filling, the steam catching you before you got the first bite to your mouth. The technique became standard in Southern and Appalachian kitchens through the 50s and 60s, passed along without a recipe card because the women who made it baked cornbread often enough that they could pour the batter without measuring. The ones who could do that aren't here to teach it now. cowboy casserole carried the swagger of the American Southwest straight into suburban kitchens of the early 1970s. The dish layered browned ground beef with canned baked beans, barbecue sauce, and shredded cheddar, then crowned everything with refrigerated Pillsbury biscuit dough before the whole thing went into the oven until golden. It thrived in the Midwest and South, showing up at school cafeterias, 4-H suppers, and anywhere families gathered with big appetites and small budgets. Some versions folded in diced tomatoes or taco seasoning. Others kept it simple, just beef, beans, and biscuits, the holy trinity of weeknight survival. The biscuit top was the genius, puffing up to create a golden lid that sealed in all the smoky, beefy steam underneath. Kids tore into it without being told twice, and adults went back for seconds without apology. The story goes that Ella Mae Hartline fell in love with tostadas while number 23, beef and noodle bake. You cooked wide egg noodles until they were barely tender, browned a pound of ground beef with onion, and stirred in a can of cream of celery soup, a cup of sour cream, and salt and pepper. You folded the noodles into the meat mixture, poured it into a buttered dish, and topped it with crushed potato chips. 30 minutes at 350, and the chips turned golden while the noodles underneath stayed creamy. The sour cream kept everything from drying out, and the crunch on top gave every bite two textures. You could smell the potato chips browning from the living room, and that was usually when the kids started setting the table without being asked. Beef and barley stew was built to last. One pot, one slow flame, and enough time to let the world outside freeze while the inside stayed warm. Ground beef browned first, then onions, carrots, barley, and water joined in. Nothing fancy, everything needed. As it simmered for hours, it thickened into a meal you could eat with a spoon or fork. The barley swelled, the cabbage softened, and the beef melted into the broth, turning a few scraps into something that tasted like plenty. It was food that nourished from the inside out, stretching a pound of meat across 3 days if it had to. Every kitchen had its version. More vegetables if the garden was kind, more water if times were lean. It was the taste of patience, of gratitude, and of winter's quiet victories. Coca-Cola beef skillet might sound like something dreamed up at a county fair food stand, but back in the 1960s, it was a weeknight marvel. You took a skillet, browned up a pound of ground beef with onions, added a healthy squeeze of ketchup, and then, here's the twist, poured in a splash of Coca-Cola. That was the secret sauce. The soda added a surprising depth, a sticky sweetness that balanced the tang of the ketchup and rounded out the beefy base. It cooked down into something thick and glossy, like a glaze that made every bite feel more indulgent than it had any right to be. Kids went wild for it, and parents loved that it took maybe 15 minutes to get on the table. Coca-Cola beef skillet was the edible proof that the best meals often come from a bit of whimsy and whatever is sitting in the fridge door. And if pasta was your pantry fallback, then the next recipe might just be your new meatloaf obsession. Using rice as a filler was one of the oldest and most dependable tricks for making ground beef go further. Grandma could take a single pound of beef and, with the addition of rice, stretch it into a whole pot of hearty food that filled every plate. Sometimes she used cooked rice, folding it in to bulk up casseroles and stews, while other times she used raw rice, letting it absorb juices as it cooked right alongside the beef. This was how porcupine meatballs became a household favorite, fluffy grains poking out from tender beef in a tomato-based sauce. It wasn't just about thrift, though. Rice added body, absorbed flavors beautifully, and made each bite feel substantial. In times when budgets were tight, this clever trick allowed families to keep eating beef dishes without breaking the bank. It was practical, resourceful, and tasted so good that no one felt they were missing out. Even now, the combination of beef and rice has a homey, comforting feel to it, reminding us of tables where nothing was wasted and meals always seemed to stretch just far enough to feed everyone gathered. Hamburger soup got made when the beef supply was nearly gone and the cellar still had things in it. A turnip, dried beans, 3 potatoes past their best. You browned whatever ground beef remained, even a quarter pound, in the bottom of the largest pot in the house and stretched it with whatever the root cellar offered. The broth was thin, built from water and a bouillon cube, thickened by nothing but a 2-hour simmer. What came up from the pot wasn't rich, but it was hot. It filled the bowl and it tasted like something, like cast iron and turnip and the faint sweetness of a carrot that had gone soft on one end. Farm kitchens across the Midwest kept some version of this going on the back burner all through the 1930s and 40s. There was no recipe, just a pot and what you had left. Hamburger upside-down pie is really one that's for people who like to experiment with their food. It has a lot of practical thought put into it, but somebody clearly had a lot of fun making this. You take ground beef and then you take the concept of a baked pie, and what do you get when you mix those two together? A layer of seasoned ground beef packed beautifully at the bottom of a baking dish, laden with onions, tomato sauce, biscuit crumbs, and a cornbread topping. This pie would be baked and then flipped upside down so the bottom layer of beef was the first thing you had, and it was filling enough to feed your entire family and then some. This dish was a part of resourceful home cooking, and it makes me agree with something I saw earlier. It said that being bored is actually good for you because it brings out your creativity. I think that people had so little to work with in these times that they were for once thinking genuinely outside of the box, and sometimes that led to some actual eureka moments, and other times it was fun, little interactive dishes like this. While it wasn't remembered much, it was still a pretty convenient meal that you could even freeze for later if you weren't feeling like eating it all in one go. Understandably, because this is a behemoth to take down on your own. If you're a fan of retro cooking, though, this is a good place to start. Sloppy Joe pie was what you made when a sandwich was not quite enough. The sweet, tangy beef, made with ketchup, mustard, and maybe brown sugar, got spooned into a dish and topped with biscuit dough or pie crust. Then it baked until golden and bubbly. It smelled like school lunches and weekday nights. The filling was classic Sloppy Joe, but the crust gave it shape. You could eat it with a fork. You could add cheese. Some families topped it with cornbread or mashed potatoes instead. It was a recipe that adapted to whatever was in the kitchen. What never changed was how satisfying it felt. One pan, one meal, one good reason to sit down and eat. It was often made after a sandwich dinner when the meat outlasted the buns. Sloppy Joe pie made the most of what was left and still gave you something to look forward to. It was humble, but proud, made for people who did not ask for much, just something warm and maybe a little sweet. Number 20. Deviled ham on toast. That little Underwood can with the red devil on the label. You peeled back the lid, spread the ham thick on a piece of white toast, maybe added a squirt of yellow mustard or a thin slice of raw onion, and called it dinner. The deviled ham was salty, smooth, and packed with enough seasoning to carry plain bread without complaint. 2 cans and 4 slices of toast made a full meal. Some people ran it under the broiler for a minute to warm the top, but most ate it cold because the point was speed, not presentation. Seniors who lived alone ate this standing at the counter more often than they would ever admit. No plate, no napkin, just toast in hand and the can on the counter with the fork still in it. Texas hash combined the bold flavors of the Southwest with the practical economy that Depression-era cooks passed down through generations. Ground beef was browned with plenty of onions and green peppers. Then rice was added along with canned tomatoes and chili powder, enough to give heat without overwhelming. The mixture was transferred to a baking dish and cooked until the rice turned tender and the flavors married into something cohesive and satisfying. For seniors living alone, Texas hash offered the advantage of a complete meal that improved with reheating, each day the spices deepening and the textures mellowing. The dish appeared in community cookbooks from Texas to Ohio, adapted by cooks who understood that regional names mattered less than solid technique and affordable ingredients. 1 pound of ground beef could provide nearly a week of solo dinners, each serving hearty enough to satisfy without anything more elaborate. Simple seasonings applied with confidence created meals worth remembering. Hamburger pie with biscuit topping was the answer to what's for dinner when the pantry held almost nothing. Ground beef was browned with onions, seasoned with salt and pepper, then spread in a baking dish and covered with canned vegetables, usually green beans or corn. Biscuit dough was dropped by spoonfuls over the top, or a single sheet was rolled out and draped over everything. The whole thing baked until the biscuits turned golden and the filling bubbled underneath. This was the meal that used up whatever canned goods were gathering dust in the cupboard and whatever vegetables needed cooking before they turned. Grandmothers made it when grocery money ran short and creativity was the only ingredient in abundance. The biscuit topping could be made from scratch or from a tube, depending on time and resources. Children loved breaking through the biscuit crust to discover the savory filling beneath. 1 pound of beef beneath all that biscuit and vegetables fed a family completely satisfied. Now, the French weren't fans of the rabbit pie, so they decided to whip up a pigeon pie instead. This delicacy dates all the way back to the 17th century when James Hart, a Scottish physician, wrote in 1633 that pigeon pies were usually served with far too much pepper. It became an instant hit after Hart's paper, and people started cutting down on the pepper a bit. This crispy dish was a savory game pie made of pigeon meat and various other ingredients traditional to French cuisine. The buttery crust made it a luxurious treat which was common on banquet tables. It was a tradition for wives to make pigeon pie after their husbands spent long days hunting for the delicious bird. But hey, tastes change, and so do our feathered friends. Braised oxtail is proof that our ancestors really knew how to make the most of every part of an animal. An oxtail typically weighs around 8 pounds and is skinned and cut into shorter lengths for this Italian cuisine. This meat is slow-cooked in red wine and braised with vegetables such as carrots, tomatoes, and even lima beans. Oxtail is packed with collagen, so this dish was also used by many women of the Victorian era for younger-looking skin. Many women used to throw parties just to serve it. They took "eat your skincare" to a whole other level. While the word once meant only the tail of an ox, today it can also refer to the tails of other cattle. Today, this dish is a gourmet delicacy, but back in the day, it was every middle-class worker's dream. The beef-filled biscuit ring was the dish that made ground beef look like it had somewhere important to be. Seasoned beef and cheese was tucked into flattened biscuit dough rounds, each one pinched shut and placed seam-side down in a ring around the inside of a bundt pan. The rolls pressed together so they'd bake into a connected crown you could pull apart at the table. Better Homes and Gardens ran variations through the 1960s and 70s because it photographed beautifully, and because in an era of covered dish suppers, a dish that looked impressive while costing almost nothing had real social value. The trick was in the pinching. If the seams weren't tight, the filling escaped into the pan, which ruined the visual but generally improved the flavor. Every household that made this had one person who couldn't seal a biscuit properly, and one person who took over that job without being asked and never let anyone forget it. The ring came out golden and puffed, the filling visible at the seams, and the first person to grab a section always pulled too hard and took half the ring with them. Nobody minded. Long before the biscuit ring filled pans in the Midwest, Volga German immigrants were already folding ground beef into dough along the Nebraska and Kansas prairie, calling it bierach or runza, depending on which family you asked. The filling was beef and cabbage, chopped cabbage wilted into browned beef, seasoned with caraway if the cook was traditional, salt and pepper if she wasn't, sealed inside soft yeasted dough and baked until the outside turned golden and the filling steamed itself into tenderness inside. These settlers brought the recipe to Nebraska and Kansas in the early 20th century and spread it the way all important recipes moved, through hands, not paper. A Nebraska woman who grew up eating them through the 1940s could tell, just from the weight of one in her hand, whether the dough-to-filling ratio was right. When the Runza restaurant chain opened in Lincoln in 1949, it gave the sandwich a consistent commercial shape, but the home version, heavier, a little uneven, was something the restaurant could approximate but never quite match. That version left with the women who made it. Living in Arizona during the 1950s, and when she moved back to Iowa, where tortillas were nearly impossible to find, she improvised. What she created, layers of crushed saltine crackers topped with seasoned ground beef, shredded lettuce, diced tomatoes, cheese, and sour cream, became known as haystacks. And by the early 1970s, the dish had spread through Mennonite and Seventh-day Adventist church communities across the Midwest. The beauty was the assembly line. You set out bowls of each ingredient and let everyone build their own. Children loved the freedom. Adults loved that it fed 30 people with 2 pounds of hamburger and a mountain of cheap toppings. Some congregations served haystacks so frequently that members joked they could build one in their sleep. The dish sat somewhere between taco salad and nachos, belonging to neither tradition but borrowing from both. Communal eating at its most democratic, where no two plates looked alike. Number 20. Hamburger gravy over rice. You browned ground beef in a skillet, sprinkled in a couple tablespoons of flour, and stirred until the flour toasted into the fat. Then you poured in milk, slowly, stirring the whole time until a thick, peppery gravy formed around the crumbled meat. You ladled it over a plate of white rice, and that was supper. No vegetables, no side dish, no garnish, just protein and starch and gravy. It sounds plain, and it was plain, but it filled you up for hours and it cost less than $1 for the whole family. Some families poured it over toast instead of rice, and some poured it over biscuits, and the arguments about which way was right could last a whole Thanksgiving. Cabbage and tomato skillet was what you made when there was nothing left to make. Ground beef, shredded cabbage, canned tomatoes, and onion, fried together until the house smelled like survival. It was not elegant, but it was honest. Every spoonful delivered the bite of pepper and the sweetness of cooked-down cabbage, proof that even a few cheap ingredients could become a family's dinner. This was the food of mill towns, tenant farms, and one-room apartments where every penny mattered. It cooked fast, served plenty, and left almost nothing to clean up. A working mother's blessing. The color alone was cheerful, red and green against the gray of winter. And though no one wrote down the recipe, everyone remembered it. The cabbage and tomato skillet was not about perfection, it was about endurance, the kind that fed both hunger and hope. Beef macaroni loaf was what happened when mid-century homemakers got bored of plain old meatloaf and decided to shake things up, just a little. At first glance, it looked like the usual mix of ground beef, breadcrumbs, and seasoning. But inside, hiding like a delicious surprise, was elbow macaroni, cooked just shy of tender and folded right into the mix. Some versions even swapped out breadcrumbs entirely and used the pasta as the binder. Then came the tomato soup, poured in for moisture, color, and that unmistakable tangy sweet kick that Campbell's fans know all too well. The result was dense, hearty, and oddly elegant, like meatloaf had finally grown up and gotten a little flair. And because macaroni stretched the meat further, it was perfect for feeding bigger families on a budget. But for folks who wanted a more southern touch, the next dish took cornbread to places it had never gone before. Flavoring with Worcestershire sauce may sound simple today, but for Grandma it was a genius shortcut that elevated humble beef into something richer. Just a few drops added layers of flavor that made plain ground beef taste almost like a steak. The tangy, savory depth of the sauce seeped into every bite, transforming burgers, meatloaf, and skillet meals into dishes that felt more special than their modest ingredients suggested. At a time when seasoning options were limited and spice cabinets weren't as stocked as they are now, Worcestershire was a miracle in a bottle. It was affordable, versatile, and long-lasting, which made it a kitchen essential. Families grew up on meals where that little splash of sauce was the secret no one talked about but everyone tasted. It gave ground beef a boldness that kept it from feeling repetitive, even if you ate it several times a week. Today, with so many sauces and condiments available, this old trick feels almost too simple to remember, but its impact remains undeniable. It was a way of making the ordinary extraordinary, with nothing more than a quick shake of the bottle. Stuffed green peppers made a quarter pound of ground beef look like abundance. You sliced the tops off 4 large peppers, stood them upright in a baking dish, and packed them tight with a filling of ground beef stretched with cooked white rice, sometimes equal parts, sometimes more rice than meat when money was short. 1 can of Campbell's tomato soup went over the top, thinned with a half can of water, and the dish baked for close to an hour. The pepper softened and sweetened. The rice expanded inside the filling. The sauce darkened at the pan's edges where it had caramelized. The USDA published stretching guides featuring stuffed peppers in 1930s budget bulletins as a formal protein extension strategy, but nobody needed the bulletin. 4 people, 4 peppers, a quarter pound of beef, 1 can of soup. You didn't need to know how to cook. You needed to know how to count. Those interesting casseroles don't just end with peanut butter. Next on our list, we're going to be dealing with beef and grape casserole, which is an example of mid-century American cooking really leaving no stone unturned. It was a combination of flavors that was pretty unexpected. Most people think that this dish came out around the 1940s to the 1960s, and that makes sense. Fruit-based experimentation with your typical average Sunday meals was a lot more common. What was interesting was the influences for this dish. Swedish meatballs with lingonberries was another thing that was growing really popular as a recipe for home cooks, and a lot of Americans tried to come up with their own spin-offs of recipes like this. Typically, it had ground or cubed beef, and this was browned with onions. Then it would be combined with grape jelly or entire grapes, and a sauce would be made for the broth. Tomato paste or Worcestershire sauce would also go in this broth, and some versions also used canned mushroom soup and sour cream to help create a more velvety texture. While the dish was definitely really ambitious and set out to accomplish a lot of bold, difficult-to-work-with flavors, it ended up not really lasting past the 60s. It seems like that one decade was an isolated incident as far as casseroles were considered. Still, is this something you would like to try? Or do you like your grapes on a separate plate from your meat? Picnic meatloaf squares were a summer favorite long before pasta salad or grilled hot dogs took over the spotlight. You would make a basic meatloaf, ground beef, breadcrumbs, eggs, and seasoning. Then chill it overnight, slice it into neat rectangles, and wrap them in wax paper like little parcels. They were meant to be eaten cold, straight from the cooler, with no heating, no mess, and no complaints. These squares were usually seasoned with dry onion soup mix, a heavy squirt of ketchup, and maybe a dash of Worcestershire sauce if someone was feeling bold. There was something kind of dignified about pulling one out during a picnic and eating it on a paper plate next to potato chips and lemonade. It was meatloaf without ceremony. They were practical, portable, and surprisingly tasty even without being warm. Some families packed them with pickles or thin slices of cheese on the side. Others just ate them plain, savoring the mix of meat, spice, and nostalgia. You could find recipes for these in community cookbooks with titles like Outdoor Favorites or Cold Table Classics. Number 19. Canned chicken and dumplings. This was the meal that made a cold apartment feel like a house. You opened a large can of chunk chicken, drained most of the liquid into a pot, added water or a splash of milk, and brought it to a low simmer. Then you dropped in small spoonfuls of biscuit dough, the kind you made with nothing but flour, baking powder, a pinch of salt, and enough shortening to hold it together. Covered the pot and let the dumplings steam for about 15 minutes without lifting the lid. That part was important. If you peeked, the dumplings went flat. The chicken fell apart into soft shreds in the broth. The dumplings puffed up thick and pillowy, soaking up the liquid from underneath while staying dry on top. Some people added a spoonful of dried parsley or a shake of black pepper, but nothing else was required. This was comfort in its most basic mechanical form. Hot starch, warm protein, and a bowl that kept your hands from shaking on a cold night. Women in Appalachia and across the rural South made versions of this going back generations, long before the chicken came in a can. The canned version was faster, but the principle was the same. You stretched a small amount of meat into a full meal by surrounding it with dough and broth. The dumplings did the heavy lifting. The chicken was almost a garnish. Grandmothers made this when their grandchildren came to visit, and there was nothing else in the pantry worth offering. The kids never knew the meal was born out of necessity. They just remembered the dumplings. They remembered the steam rising when the lid came off and the way the whole kitchen smelled like flour and warm broth for the rest of the evening. Unstuffed pepper casserole delivered all the flavors of traditional stuffed peppers without the fussy work of hollowing out vegetables and arranging them carefully. Ground beef was browned with onions, then diced green peppers were added along with rice, canned tomatoes, and seasonings that reminded everyone of the original dish. Everything was combined in a baking dish, topped with cheese, and baked until bubbling and golden. For seniors whose hands had grown unsteady or whose patience for intricate cooking had waned, this casserole was liberation, the same beloved flavors in a fraction of the time. The rice absorbed the tomato juices while the peppers softened but retained enough texture to announce their presence. One casserole provided multiple meals, reheating even better the second and third day as flavors continued to develop. The recipe appeared in senior center newsletters, recommended specifically for those cooking alone who wanted familiar comfort without exhausting themselves in the kitchen. Beef and corn pudding was the savory custard that turned humble ingredients into something almost elegant. Ground beef was browned with onions, then spread in a baking dish and topped with a mixture of canned cream corn, eggs, and milk. The whole thing baked until the corn mixture set into a soft, pudding-like layer over the seasoned beef beneath. The texture was unlike anything else, creamy corn custard giving way to savory meat with every spoonful. This wasn't a dish that appeared in fancy cookbooks, but it showed up at church suppers and family dinners where grandmothers wanted to make something different. The corn pudding stretched 1 pound of beef to feed 8 people when served with bread and a simple salad. Children loved the sweetness of the corn against the savory beef. The dish could be assembled ahead and baked when dinner time arrived. It represented the kind of quiet creativity that made ordinary ingredients feel special. Ever wondered what the ultimate American comfort food was back in the day? Well, the only right answer is the veal and ham pie. This hearty pie combined the delicate flavors of veal with the salty goodness of ham. The pie's popularity surged during the Victorian era. It originated in the kitchens of English settlers and was a practical choice for using up leftovers, but soon became a meal for the elite. While it was a luxurious delicacy in England, it was a staple in large households in America. Not only was it easy to whip up, but was also cheap to make, which made it perfect for communal gatherings and large families. If you want to give your grandparents a rush of nostalgia, ask them about this meaty goodness, and who knows, your grandma might even dust off some cookbooks. Love it or hate it, there's no denying that haggis is a unique and iconic dish. So, what does this dish consist of, you may ask? Well, this Scottish dish is made from sheep's heart, liver, and lungs, mixed with oats and spices, and cooked in a sheep's stomach. Yes, you heard that right. Robert Burns' poem, Address to a Haggis of 1786, made this meal Scotland's very own national dish and a literary classic. It is traditionally served with turnips and potatoes. Back in the day, haggis was popular everywhere around the globe, but it's limited to only Scotland now. While haggis might not be everyone's cup of tea, it's definitely a dish worth trying at least once. Mock prime rib patties were the Depression's most theatrical invention. Ground beef shaped and scored to look like something expensive, served to people who hadn't seen a real rib roast in years and weren't going to anytime soon. The technique was deliberate. A pound of ground beef mixed with onion and seasoned firmly, shaped into an oblong loaf with a rounded top, then scored in a crosshatch that browned in the oven to mimic the crust of a standing rib roast. Sliced at the table with the scored surface facing up, it looked, to anyone who wanted to see it that way, like something that had cost real money. These were the kitchens of women who understood that dignity at the table mattered as much as the food itself, and that a meal which looked like abundance was better for the spirit than one that advertised its own poverty. Some cooks inserted half rings of raw onion into the scored grooves before roasting. The onion caramelized into the surface layer and sweetened it. That technique, humble beef made to carry its head high, was a skill and a form of pride. It faded with the memory of why it had ever needed to exist. When General Mills launched Hamburger Helper in August 1971, ground beef had just climbed to 66 cents a pound, and the box promised to stretch 1 pound into a meal for 5. The first flavors, beef noodle, potato stroganoff, chili tomato, hash, and rice oriental, sold so fast that within 12 months, 27% of American households had bought at least one box. But thousands of home cooks had been making their own versions from scratch for years. The homemade method was nearly identical. Brown a pound of ground beef with diced onion, stir in dry pasta, add water or broth with paprika, garlic powder, and onion salt, then simmer until the noodles absorbed the liquid and turned thick. A handful of shredded cheddar stirred in at the end finished it. The scratch version cost less and tasted better, but convenience won the decade. By 1975, the Helping Hand mascot, a four-fingered talking glove, was as recognizable as Betty Crocker herself. Number 19. Swedish meatballs. Not the kind from a frozen bag, the real ones. You mixed ground beef with breadcrumbs, 1 egg, finely grated onion, a pinch of allspice, a pinch of nutmeg, salt and pepper, and just enough milk to keep them tender. You rolled them small, about the size of a walnut, and browned them in butter in a cast-iron skillet. When they were dark on every side, you pulled them out and made the sauce in the same pan. Butter, flour, beef broth, and a long pour of sour cream stirred until it was smooth and pale brown. The meatballs went back in and simmered until the sauce thickened around them. The allspice was the secret. Most Americans had never tasted it in meat before, and that faint, warm sweetness underneath the pepper was what made people ask what you did differently. Scandinavian families brought this recipe to Minnesota and Wisconsin decades earlier, and by the 1970s, it had spread to every corner of the country through potluck suppers and women's magazines. Church fellowship halls served them by the hundreds, piled on platters next to toothpicks and a stack of napkins. The women who made them rolled dozens at a time, lining them up on sheet pans before browning them in batches. It was tedious work, standing over a hot skillet, turning each one by hand, and nobody paid you for it. But the allspice was doing something no frozen bag could replicate. It was turning plain ground beef into something that tasted like it came from somewhere old and far away. And at the end of the night, when the platters came back empty, the woman who made them knew she had fed a room full of people something worth remembering. Cabbage and rice bake was an act of comfort disguised as frugality. Leftover rice met cabbage and beef in a casserole dish, topped with breadcrumbs or a drizzle of milk to keep it moist. It baked until tender, the top golden, the smell rich and homey. This dish was how families turned scarcity into satisfaction. It filled bellies without emptying wallets, and its leftovers reheated even better the next day. Many cooks flavored it with paprika, garlic, or tomato, each one adding their own touch of love. The rice made it stretch further, the cabbage made it wholesome, the beef made it feel complete. Served in deep scoops with bread and butter, it was more than a meal. It was reassurance that even hard times could taste good. In quiet kitchens across America, cabbage and rice bake became the taste of perseverance made edible. Hamburger spoon-bread casserole was as southern as sitting on a porch swing with a glass of sweet tea, and it brought all the heartwarming charm you would expect from something served at a 1940s church supper. Spoon-bread, for the uninitiated, is not exactly bread and not quite pudding. It is somewhere in between. It is soft, warm, and creamy, like cornbread that has decided to ditch its edges and just melt in your mouth. Now imagine that heavenly texture layered over seasoned ground beef. The beef underneath was usually cooked with onions, garlic, and a dash of pepper or hot sauce. This dish was a hug in a casserole dish, soft, savory, and so filling you might not need anything else on the plate. It was also one of those recipes that always tasted better the next day if there were leftovers at all. But if this feels too soft and cozy for your taste, let us head into something born straight from scarcity and grit. Making a gravy base from beef drippings was one of the most practical and delicious habits Grandma swore by. After frying ground beef, she never just poured off the pan juices, they were too valuable to waste. Instead, she whisked in flour, maybe a splash of broth or milk, and built a flavorful gravy that could be ladled over mashed potatoes, bread, or noodles. This simple act turned a basic skillet of beef into a complete, comforting meal that stretched to feed more mouths. It gave dinners depth and warmth, making even small portions feel satisfying. Families relied on this trick not only because it saved money, but because it created flavor from what others might have discarded. The aroma of that sizzling gravy filled kitchens and promised a meal that was both hearty and resourceful. These days, we're often told to drain and discard fat for health reasons. But back then, every drop was an opportunity. That was the beauty of Grandma's cooking, knowing how to turn scraps into something rich, flavorful, and worth remembering long after the plates were cleared. Ground beef tamale pie was what happened when the Southwest met the Depression and neither one backed down. You made a cornmeal mush, cornmeal stirred into boiling salted water until thick. Spread half across the bottom and up the sides of a greased baking dish, filled it with spiced ground beef, onion, canned tomatoes, kidney beans, and chili powder, then spread the remaining mush over the top as a crust and baked it until the cornmeal firmed into something you could lift in wedges. Texas Extension Service bulletins in the 1930s documented tamale pie as a formal budget protein strategy, and it stayed in regular rotation through the 1960s across the South and Southwest. It was the working-class answer to the tamale, all the flavor of masa and spiced filling without the labor of wrapping individual portions. You knew it was ready when the crust went from wet pale to golden dry at the edges. Mock turtle soup is something that I'm dead sure you would not have seen coming. See, it's something that came out of 18th century England as a substitute for real turtle soup, which, by the way, was insanely popular in these times. People used to actually consider it something of a delicacy. During the Georgian and Victorian eras, green turtle soup would have sea turtles in it, and it was an incredibly prized dish popular among the local aristocracy. Before you crack a nice little cutting-edge joke about how British cuisine is the strangest thing on the planet, this was also popular in American high society, and it's something that got us through the Depression. That's right, mock turtle soup was something that people would make as much as they could when real turtles weren't around or were too expensive. Now, real turtle meat is known for having an incredibly rich and gelatinous broth. The key to mock turtle soup was just to start with the head of a calf or an oxtail, boil it down with a blend of vegetables like carrots, celery, and onions and a spice rub, and slow cooking it. Next, once all the natural collagen was extracted, people would usually add in wine or sherry or Madeira, and this was really common in traditional turtle soup. It replicates the texture of the actual turtle meat, and cooks would try very hard to get that down right. It's one of the most interesting pieces of mock food culture we have, and it shows how good people got at imitating different kinds of foods without the core ingredients. Salisbury steak casserole was the homemade version of a frozen food legend. Instead of pulling a silver tray from the oven, families made their own from scratch, and honestly, it was usually better. This version called for seasoned ground beef shaped into thick oval patties, then baked in a mushroom and onion gravy. It was rich, saucy, and had that stick-to-your-ribs kind of feel. If you were lucky, someone would sprinkle crispy fried onions on top during the last few minutes in the oven, adding that perfect crunch to an already comforting dish. It was not a fancy meal, but it felt like something special. Some people added Worcestershire sauce or a splash of soy for extra umami, but most just used canned soup and a good hand with salt and pepper. You would serve it with mashed potatoes, egg noodles, or a slice of white bread to sop up all that gravy. Kids loved it because it tasted like fast food. Adults loved it because it was hearty and cheap. Number 16. Canned beef ravioli. You opened the can, poured the ravioli into a saucepan, and heated it over medium until the sauce started to bubble around the edges. That was the whole recipe. The ravioli came already stuffed, already sauced, already seasoned. All you had to do was get it warm. Chef Boyardee was the name on most of those cans, and millions of people grew up eating it straight from the pot with a spoon because transferring it to a bowl felt like a wasted step. The beef inside the pasta pockets was soft and finely ground, more paste than meat, but it carried enough flavor to make every bite feel intentional. Seniors ate this on nights when standing at the stove for more than 5 minutes felt like too much to ask. One can, one burner, one pot, and dinner was done before the evening news came on. Skillet beef and macaroni was the busy cook's answer to dinners that needed to appear quickly without sacrificing heartiness or flavor. Ground beef was browned directly in a large skillet, then uncooked macaroni was added along with canned tomatoes, water, and simple seasonings. Everything simmered together, covered until the pasta absorbed the liquid and turned tender, the beef and tomatoes creating a sauce that clung to every piece. For seniors who found themselves exhausted by elaborate cooking, this one-pan meal meant dinner in 30 minutes with minimal cleanup. The recipe required no draining, no separate pots, just patience while the skillet worked its magic. Cheese could be stirred in at the end for richness, or the dish served plain for those watching their budgets. This was practical cooking that home economists promoted during decades when efficiency mattered as much as nutrition. The dish comforted seniors eating alone, providing both sustenance and satisfaction. Beef patties with brown gravy was the simple supper that appeared on tables when fancy wasn't possible or necessary. Ground beef was seasoned with salt, pepper, and a little Worcestershire sauce, then shaped into patties and fried in a skillet until browned. The patties were removed while flour was stirred into the drippings. Then beef broth or water was added to create a simple brown gravy. The patties returned to the pan to simmer in the gravy until everything was heated through and the flavors melded together. This wasn't hamburger steak with its binders and fillers, just pure beef with honest gravy made from the drippings. Grandmothers served this over rice or mashed potatoes, the gravy turning simple starch into something satisfying. 1 pound of beef made 4 large patties that fed the family when accompanied by plenty of gravy and sides. The dish required no recipe because there was nothing complicated about it, just technique passed from mother to daughter through observation. Squirrel stew might sound unusual today, but it was a popular dish in rural areas. Yep, our bushy-tailed friends were once a common ingredient in many kitchens. Also known as Brunswick stew, it was a tomato-based stew generally involving local beans, vegetables, and originally small game meat such as squirrel. However, many variations from around the world used rabbit meat too. The origin of this meaty stew is controversial at best, as the states of Virginia and Georgia both claim its birth, with Brunswick County in Virginia and the city of Brunswick in Georgia claiming it was developed there. To keep things peaceful, let's just say Virginia and Georgia both played a role in creating this delicious stew. Squirrel meat was easily hunted and provided a necessary source of protein. With the rise of chicken, squirrel stew has fallen out of flavor. But hey, this one is pretty easy to whip up and will satisfy your Thursday night meat cravings like no other. We're back to the basics with this one as boiled mutton. Who doesn't love some boiled mutton? This dish exists in almost every part of the world, with every culture having its own unique variation. The mutton was often placed in a large pot with root vegetables like carrots, turnips, and potatoes, slow-cooked until the meat fell apart and the vegetables were tender. This dish was the perfect meal to warm your insides on a cold winter day. Boiled mutton emerged as a common meal in medieval Europe, especially for the lower classes where it was cooked only using meat and water. Now, this one is slowly becoming more and more outdated as people usually go for more flavorful meats. But with the rise of Chinese hot pots, instant boiled mutton might just make a comeback. Haystacks were invented in Iowa in the 1950s by Ella Mae Hartline, and the origin story makes complete sense the moment you hear it. She and her husband had lived in Arizona, loved tostadas, and when they moved back to Iowa, tostadas weren't something you could find. So she built a version from what was available: seasoned ground beef, canned beans, shredded cheese, diced tomato and onion, layered on saltine crackers or corn chips, and called it a haystack because of how it looked when assembled, the layers tumbling up into a loose pile. The dish spread through Iowa potlucks and church dinners with the speed of something that requires no skill, accepts any preference, and scales from 5 to 50 with equal ease. By the 1970s, it had developed regional variations: Hawaiian versions with chow mein noodles, church versions with Velveeta, cafeteria versions with whatever was in the pantry. But the base was always layers, ground beef, and the pleasure of building your own plate the way you wanted it. Nobody makes it anymore because nobody has the church supper to bring it to. Family goulash bore almost no resemblance to the Hungarian original, but nobody in America seemed to mind. The version that appeared in the 1970s Betty Crocker cookbook called for ground beef browned with chopped onion, stirred together with cooked fine noodles, sliced celery, canned tomatoes, a half cup of catsup, and a jar of sliced mushrooms, then simmered covered for 30 to 45 minutes. It was pure Midwestern comfort, soft, tomatoey, and filling in a way that required zero culinary skill. The dish thrived because it used pantry staples that every household already owned, and it stretched a single pound of hamburger across 4 generous servings. Children who grew up eating it in the early 70s often remembered it as their favorite dinner without knowing what goulash actually was. The real beauty was the hands-off cooking. Once everything was in the skillet, you walked away and let time do the work. Number 18. Cowboy beans with ground beef. You browned a pound of ground beef with diced onion, drained the grease, and stirred in 2 cans of pork and beans, a couple tablespoons of brown sugar, a squirt of yellow mustard, a splash of ketchup, and a few shakes of Worcestershire sauce. You poured it into a baking dish and let it go for an hour at 325. The beans turned dark and sticky, and the beef disappeared into them so completely that every spoonful had meat in it. This showed up at every backyard gathering in every small town in America, and the pan was always scraped clean before anything else on the table. The brown sugar caramelized around the edges of the dish and turned the top into a crust you could crack with a spoon. Ground beef and oat loaf was the Depression's answer to meatloaf on a budget. When breadcrumbs were too dear, rolled oats stepped in, binding the meat and stretching it twice as far. Mixed with egg, onion, and a thin smear of tomato, it baked into a dense, hearty loaf that filled the kitchen with warmth. Each slice was firm and chewy, rich with the taste of hard work and determination. Served with mashed potatoes or a spoon of gravy, it gave families a sense of dignity. Real food, real effort, no waste. It was a meal of quiet pride, the kind that reminded people they could make do and still make something good. Even cold the next day, it tasted like comfort, its edges slightly sweet from the caramelized glaze. In every crumb was the story of making a little go a long way, and doing it with grace. Wartime ration hash was not glamorous. It did not pretend to be. But in homes across America during the 1940s, it was dinner, and often a lifesaver. This dish was the ultimate answer to food rationing and meat shortages. You would take whatever you had, maybe a handful of ground beef, a bruised potato, a few limp carrots, and you made it work. Breadcrumbs or oats were added to stretch the beef as far as it could possibly go. Sometimes there were bits of canned green beans or peas tossed in, and if you were lucky, an egg to bind it all together. Everything went into a pan and got crisped until the edges browned and the bottom stuck just a bit to the skillet. Flavor gold, right there. It taught families how to use every last crumb, and it gave a warm, filling meal when the world felt cold and uncertain. But when times got a little better, and people had a bit more to spend, things got saucier, cheesier, and a whole lot more comforting. Shaping beef into steaks was one of those clever illusions that made dinners feel fancier than they really were. With a bit of seasoning and careful shaping, Grandma could take plain ground beef and press it into oval patties that looked like individual cuts of steak. Once browned in a skillet and topped with gravy or onions, they gave the impression of a hearty, steakhouse-style meal without the cost of real steak. For families who couldn't often afford higher cuts of meat, this trick was a way to enjoy the feeling of indulgence without breaking the budget. Kids grew up thinking they were eating something special, and in a way, they were. The special part was how much love and creativity went into making dinner stretch. The technique wasn't complicated, but it carried a sense of pride in serving meals that looked more extravagant than they were. Today we call it Salisbury steak or hamburger steak, but the heart of it is the same, turning ground beef into something greater than the sum of its parts. It was resourcefulness wrapped in flavor, and it left memories stronger than the meat itself. Hamburger pie was never quite a quiche and never quite a casserole, And that in-between quality was exactly what made it so practical for women who built supper from scratch through the 1940s and 50s. You browned ground beef with onion, added whatever vegetables the refrigerator had left, poured the filling into a skillet lined with biscuit dough, laid more dough over the top, crimped the edges like a real pie, and baked it until the crust went golden. Betty Crocker published a version in the 1950s that spread it nationally. She made it on Thursdays, the day before payday, the day the refrigerator was at its most creative. Nobody makes hamburger pie on Thursdays anymore because nobody is counting days to payday in quite that way. The arithmetic has changed. The pie hasn't been seen since. Meat Jell-O, or more commonly known as aspic, is one of the best creations to ever come out of Western culinary history. In this entire list, we have a growing pattern of people mixing gelatinous textures alongside sweet and savory flavors, and this dish was arguably the ultimate culmination of that entire trend. So aspic was actually something that people usually associated with fine dining. It was also used to encase these fancy poached meats, which were sometimes imported, plus the thing just looked really fancy. Starts to make sense when you think about it. The early 20th century saw it turning into more of a generalized thing, though. The bizarre evolution of meat Jell-O was really defined by commercialized powdered gelatin and canned soups, which meant that home cooks now had all the tools they needed to make as many aspic-based wonders as they wanted. It's still pretty hot today, comparatively. The macaroni beef ring was more than just a recipe, it was a showpiece. You took cooked elbow macaroni and ground beef, mixed it with eggs and tomato sauce, and pressed the whole thing into a ring mold. After it baked and set, you flipped it onto a serving plate, and there it stood, a golden brown pasta wreath. But the real drama came next. The center of the ring was filled with creamed peas, buttered corn, or even leftover stew if that is what you had. It was the kind of dinner that turned heads at church potlucks or family dinners. Kids would laugh, adults would smile politely, and everyone would eat it anyway because it was surprisingly good. The pasta held together just enough to slice, and the beef gave it weight and flavor. Sometimes there was cheese mixed in, sometimes it was just seasoned with onion powder and salt. Either way, it was a clever use of pantry staples and leftover meat. Number 17. Canned beef tamales. You pulled them out of the can still wrapped in their paper husks, peeled each one carefully so the masa did not stick, lined them up in a baking dish, and poured the chili sauce from the can over the top. Some people added shredded cheese or a spoonful of enchilada sauce before putting the dish in the oven for 20 minutes. The tamales came out soft and warm with the corn masa soaking up every drop of sauce. A single tall can held 6 tamales, enough for a full dinner with a side of rice or a handful of tortilla chips. Grocery stores across the Southwest and the Midwest stocked these by the case, and they disappeared off the shelf faster than almost any other canned meat product. People who grew up eating them can still describe the way the paper peeled away from the masa in one clean strip when the tamale was heated just right. Beef noodle soup was the answer to cold nights and tired bones, a pot of warmth that required minimal effort but delivered maximum comfort. Ground beef was browned with onions and celery, then covered with broth and water until the pot was nearly full. Egg noodles were added along with diced carrots and simple seasonings, salt, pepper, bay leaf, perhaps a pinch of thyme. The soup simmered until the noodles turned soft and the vegetables yielded to gentle pressure, the broth growing rich with beef flavor and starchy body from the pasta. For seniors living alone, this soup meant several days of meals from one cooking session, each bowl reheated in minutes when energy ran low. The noodles broke down slightly with reheating, thickening the broth into something almost stew-like that clung to spoons and warmed from the inside. This was the kind of practical cooking that kept seniors fed during winters when leaving the house felt impossible and elaborate meals seemed beyond reach. Creamed beef on toast was the breakfast for dinner meal that working families relied on when time and money were both short. Ground beef was browned and crumbled, then stirred into a simple white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk. The creamy mixture was spooned over slices of toasted bread, creating a filling meal from ingredients every kitchen contained. Peas were sometimes stirred in for color and nutrition, stretching the dish further while adding sweetness. This wasn't glamorous food, but it delivered the protein and carbohydrates that hardworking bodies needed. Grandmothers made it on weeknights when fancier meals weren't possible, knowing their families would leave the table satisfied. Children grew up eating this without realizing it was budget food. They just knew it tasted good. The dish came together in 15 minutes and required no special ingredients or techniques. 1 pound of beef and all that creamy sauce served 6 people easily. It was honest food for honest appetites. If you think the beef heart is off limits for cuisine, you're wrong, because stuffed hearts were once a celebrated dish. This dish sounds like something out of a horror movie, but it was actually quite common. Think of the beef heart cleaned, stuffed with a mixture of breadcrumbs, herbs, and often pine nuts or raisins, and then roasted or braised. Sounds appetizing yet? This economical and tasty meal was a testament to the nose-to-tail philosophy of cooking, where no part of the animal was wasted. In Europe, the practice of stuffing animal hearts dates back to medieval times. It was a popular dish amongst the working class in England, while it was reserved for the elite in France. Eating hearts isn't as common today, but if you ever tried this one, you'd understand the hype. Corned beef and cabbage. A classic St. Patrick's Day dish, but did you know it was once a common comfort food? Known as salt beef in some Commonwealth countries, this American-Irish dish was a hearty protein source and a staple on the table during the 17th through the early 20th centuries. It was tinned along with sugar and spices during World War I and World War II when fresh meat was rationed. Cabbage brought in the right amount of nutrients, making this meal not just delicious, but also a healthy choice. While still popular in some circles, corned beef and cabbage aren't half as famous as it once was. But if you're ever up for some good old-fashioned cooking, there are recipes for this one all over the internet, and they're pretty easy to follow. Chow mein hot dish emerged from Minnesota church kitchens in the 1960s as one of the Midwest's more unlikely inventions. Ground beef, cream of mushroom soup, and celery baked in a deep dish and finished with a layer of crunchy chow mein noodles from a La Choy can. The noodles came from Chinese-American cuisine, the cream soup came from Campbell's, the beef came from the freezer, and the combination worked. The noodles staying crisp on top while softening slightly at their undersides where the steam reached them. Minnesota home cooks knew the trick. You never stirred the noodle layer into the casserole, you laid it across the top in the last 15 minutes and pulled the dish the moment the edges began to curl. Church cookbooks from the Twin Cities ran versions through the 60s and 70s as if it were as natural as anything else on the table. It faded when La Choy went out of fashion, and the idea of Chinese pantry staples in a beef casserole started to seem stranger than it had in 1968. The woman who knew when to pull it from the oven isn't making it anymore. The aroma of green peppers softening in tomato sauce filled the kitchen with a smell that was equal parts savory and slightly sweet. And for families in the early 1970s, it meant stuffed green pepper casserole was in the oven. The original stuffed peppers required careful hollowing, blanching, and individual filling, which was more fuss than most weeknight cooks could manage. So somebody, the credit has been claimed by dozens of community cookbooks from Pennsylvania to Nebraska, had the genius idea of deconstructing the whole thing into a casserole. Diced green peppers, browned ground beef, cooked rice, canned tomato soup, and shredded cheese all went into a baking dish together, layered or stirred depending on the household. 30 minutes at 350 degrees produced the same flavors without the architecture. The casserole version fed more people, reheated better, and didn't collapse on the plate the way individual stuffed peppers always seem to. It was a perfect example of how 1970s home cooks valued practicality over presentation. Number 17. Beef enchilada casserole. You browned ground beef, stirred in a can of enchilada sauce and a can of drained beans, then layered it in a baking dish with torn corn tortillas and shredded cheddar. 3 layers, sauce on top, more cheese, and 30 minutes in the oven. It was enchiladas without the rolling, which meant you could make it in 10 minutes of active work and still put something on the table that tasted like you had been in the kitchen all afternoon. The tortillas softened into the sauce and turned almost silky, and the edges where the cheese hit the hot glass crisped into little chips. That crispy cheese edge was the part everybody fought over, and the smart ones cut their portion from the corner of the pan where there was more of it. Cabbage and sausage stew was winter's answer to hunger. In homes where meat was precious, a single sausage could flavor an entire pot. Cabbage, onion, and potato took up the rest, slow-cooked until they soaked in every drop of smoky richness. The broth was peppery, the smell both humble and hearty. Served in thick bowls with bread, it was the kind of meal that made the world seem softer for a little while. This dish crossed cultures, found in Polish, German, and African American kitchens alike, each with its own rhythm and seasoning. It was proof that good food did not need abundance, only attention. The stew tasted better the next day, its flavors deepening as the cabbage gave up its sweetness. It was the kind of meal that asked for nothing but gave everything: warmth, comfort, and the quiet assurance that spring would come again. Old-school goulash, or as some knew it, American chop suey, was the dish that proved ground beef and elbow macaroni were soulmates. This one-pot wonder became a fixture on stovetops from Maine to Missouri. It started with browned beef, onions, and garlic, all bubbling away in a pot. Then came the crushed tomatoes or tomato sauce, which turned the mix into a deep red stew. Toss in a few handfuls of cooked macaroni, and suddenly you had dinner for 6, and maybe lunch tomorrow. What made goulash so special was not just the taste, though that was plenty satisfying. It was the simplicity. It was comfort food with no rules, and that made it a favorite in kitchens where imagination mattered more than a well-stocked pantry. Goulash was the dish that filled plates and hearts at the same time. But if you think that was creative, wait until you see what happened when someone took a bag of corn chips and turned it into dinner. Saving bacon grease for frying beef was one of Grandma's quiet secrets for adding depth to otherwise simple meals. Whenever bacon was cooked, the fat was carefully poured into a tin or jar and kept on the counter or in the fridge. Later, when it came time to brown ground beef, she'd scoop in a spoonful, letting the smoky, savory flavor mingle with the meat. This gave even the plainest beef dishes a richness that couldn't be matched by oil or butter. It wasn't just about taste either. It was about never wasting something that could be used again. Bacon grease was considered liquid gold in many kitchens, and it flavored everything it touched. For ground beef, it was transformative, turning ordinary patties or gravies into meals that tasted indulgent. Today, we often discard bacon drippings without a thought, but back then, this was part of a cycle of cooking that made sure nothing went to waste. It's a trick that not only saved money, but also gave dishes the kind of flavor that sticks in your memory long after the meal is gone. If tamale pie belonged to the Southwest, the hamburger and rice casserole belonged to every church basement from Ohio to Minnesota, and the women who made it knew something the recipe card never mentioned. You browned the ground beef with chopped celery and onion, combined it with pre-cooked white rice and a can of cream of mushroom soup thinned with a splash of milk, packed everything into a greased baking dish, covered it with cheddar, and baked it at 350 until the cheese browned. The timing mattered more than the ingredients. Pull it 5 minutes early and it was soupy. Leave it 5 minutes too long and the rice went dry at the corners. You didn't set a timer. You learned to smell when it was ready. That moment when the cheese stopped smelling raw and started smelling toasted. Church cookbooks from Ohio and Minnesota documented this casserole throughout the 1950s and 60s as the most reliably replicated dish at covered dish suppers. Anyone could make it. Not everyone could make it right. She could. Nobody at that church ever figured out quite why hers tasted different. Beef stuffed donuts are a really bizarre thing to think about. They actually have been a part of tradition for so long. What tradition, you might ask? Well, savory fried dough dishes have been pretty consistently popular across America, believe it or not. Just look at all the meat pies we have. Unlike today's sweet donuts topped with chocolate frosting and red velvet, though, these were a popular way to make some portable food that also filled you up. Different versions of meat-filled fried donuts looked like beef mixed with onions and garlic, or gravy, or even cheese on the inside. So why did something so good disappear? Well, it's just hard to keep up with all the different things the world had to offer. Pre-packaged donuts, frozen ones, ready-made baked goods, all of it meant that people were far less interested in doing basic home baking than usual. Nowadays even, if someone does want to get cooking, they usually think about something that can at least get a couple of views. Savory ground beef Jell-O mold sounds like a joke now, but back then, it was an actual dish you could find in cookbooks across the country. Picture this: ground beef cooked with celery and onions, mixed with tomato or beef-flavored gelatin, and poured into a mold to chill. It came out looking like a jelly-covered meatloaf, and yes, people served it with pride. The gelatin acted as a binder and preservative, letting the dish be prepared ahead of time and stored without refrigeration for longer than usual. It was a wartime or emergency pantry trick that somehow found its way into mainstream cooking in the 1960s. Housewives would slice it into wedges and serve it with saltines or a dollop of mayonnaise, believing it was elegant. It was not, but it was practical. Gelatin was cheap and available, and this dish used only one pan and required no baking. Whether it was a result of rationing, cold buffets, or sheer culinary curiosity, it definitely left an impression. Number 18. Spam fried rice. You cooked a pot of white rice the day before and left it in the refrigerator overnight so the grains dried out and separated. The next evening, you diced half a can of Spam into small cubes, fried them in a hot wok or skillet until the outsides crisped, pushed them to the side, scrambled an egg in the open space, and then tossed in the cold rice with a few shakes of soy sauce. Stirred it all together over high heat until the rice picked up a faint char on the bottom. If you had a green onion, you sliced it thin on top. This was a meal that came to the mainland with military families who had been stationed in Hawaii and the Pacific. It traveled well because the ingredients traveled well. A bag of rice, a can of Spam, an egg, and a bottle of soy sauce could sit in any kitchen for months. Beef and rice casserole was the reliable weeknight dinner that required almost no attention once assembled. Ground beef was browned with onions, then combined with uncooked rice, canned tomatoes, and beef broth in a baking dish. The casserole was covered tightly and baked until the rice absorbed all the liquid, emerging fluffy and infused with meaty flavor. For seniors who found standing at the stove exhausting, this hands-off approach meant dinner practically made itself while they rested. The dish was forgiving of timing. An extra 10 minutes in the oven rarely caused problems. Cheese could be sprinkled on top during the final minutes for extra richness, or the casserole served plain for simpler tastes. Church cookbooks featured dozens of variations, each family convinced their version was best. The casserole provided balanced nutrition and reheated beautifully throughout the week. This was the kind of practical cooking that kept seniors fed without demanding too much energy or attention. Beef and bean bake was the budget stretcher that turned a pound of meat into a feast for the whole family. Ground beef was browned with onions, then combined with canned pork and beans, a splash of ketchup, brown sugar, and mustard in a baking dish. The mixture baked until bubbling and slightly caramelized around the edges, the sweet and tangy sauce coating every bite. This wasn't fancy food. It was picnic food, potluck food, the kind of dish that showed up at every outdoor gathering. Grandmothers made it because the beans stretched the meat impossibly far while the sauce made everything taste better. Children loved the sweetness while parents appreciated how far 1 pound of beef could go. The dish could be doubled or tripled easily for larger crowds. It traveled well and held on buffet tables without losing quality. Beef and bean bake represented practical cooking at its most satisfying, proving that economy and flavor could coexist. Bear meat might seem like something out of a survivalist's handbook, but it was once a prized delicacy in many cultures. The roast loin of bear was considered a special occasion dish, reserved for feasts and celebrations. This dish has deep roots in the culinary traditions of the early American settlers. As you can imagine, hunting a bear was a daunting task, so this meal was a reward for bravery. Apart from the hunting of the bears, this one wasn't complicated to whip up. All you needed was the loin, which is the tender strip of meat along the backbone, which was often roasted over an open fire. Now, this is one meaty dish. Well, it doesn't take rocket science to know why this one has vanished from our tables. I bet you're not up to the task of hunting a bear, are you? Grape jelly meatballs were the 1960s best-kept potluck secret, and the rule was simple. You never told anyone what was in the sauce until after they'd had seconds. Equal parts grape jelly and chili sauce into the pot. The meatballs simmered in that sweet, sour purple glaze until they turned glossy and tender. And the whole thing went into a crock pot you could carry across town. Every woman who made them swore the recipe was too embarrassing to share. Every woman who tasted them begged for it. The chemistry was real. The jelly's pectin thickened the sauce. The fruit's acidity cut through the fat, and the result tasted like nothing you could name but couldn't stop eating. Church socials, baby showers, and neighborhood suppers from the late 1950s through the 80s all had a crock pot of these somewhere on the table. When someone finally asked what was in the sauce and you told them, you watched the same expression cross every face: disbelief, reconsideration, and the slow reach back for another one. That expression was the whole point. Beef and olive casserole showed up at church ladies' luncheons and covered dish suppers in the 1950s and quietly divided every room between people who understood it and people who didn't. Ground beef, browned with onion, folded into cream of mushroom soup with a full can of sliced black olives, poured over egg noodles, and baked until the edges crisped. The olives were not decoration and not optional. Their briny, meaty quality lifted the whole dish past ordinary, and they had to cook into the beef, releasing their oil into the pan and softening while the casserole set around them. This was insider knowledge. The women who made it correctly had figured out that black olives and ground beef had a natural sympathy tracing back to Southern European immigrant kitchens. The women who substituted or omitted were making something else. The dish disappeared quietly when the black olive became a pizza topping rather than a casserole staple. Few people today remember that rice-a-roni, the San Francisco treat, as the jingle promised, was the backbone of countless ground beef skillets in the early 1970s. Golden Grain had been selling the boxed rice and vermicelli mix since 1958, and by the 70s, home cooks had figured out that browning a pound of ground beef and stirring it into a prepared box of beef-flavored rice-a-roni created a one-pan dinner in under 20 minutes. The vermicelli toasted golden in butter before the liquid went in, giving the whole dish a nutty depth that plain rice couldn't match. A can of cream of mushroom soup folded in at the end turned it into something almost luxurious, creamy and rich where the original was simple and brothy. Topped with shredded cheddar and a scattering of French's fried onions, then baked for 20 minutes, it became a casserole that families served proudly at potlucks and neighborhood suppers across suburbia. Number 16. Cheeseburger macaroni. You browned ground beef, drained it, tossed in cooked elbow macaroni, stirred in a can of tomato soup, a handful of shredded American cheese, and a teaspoon of mustard. 5 minutes on medium heat and the cheese melted into the tomato and coated every noodle. It was the homemade version of what came in a box, except it tasted better because you controlled the salt, and the cheese was real. Kids could not tell the difference. Adults could, and they liked the homemade one more because it reminded them of how their mothers made it before the boxed kind existed. The mustard was the key. Without it, the sauce tasted flat, but with just a teaspoon, it woke everything up. Cabbage and dumpling pot was a meal that filled both stomachs and hearts when little else could. It started with a pot of broth, sometimes made from beef bones, sometimes just salted water, and a heap of sliced cabbage simmering slowly until tender. Then came the dumplings, spoonfuls of soft flour dough dropped directly into the bubbling pot. They puffed up as they cooked, absorbing the savory flavor of the broth and the sweetness of the cabbage. The result was a meal thick and comforting enough to feed a family through the coldest night. It smelled like home and patience, like something that had taken time even when there was not much to spare. No one went hungry around that pot, and even the simplest ingredients tasted rich when shared with love. It was the kind of food that made silence at the table feel like gratitude. Corn chip beef bake was born from the kind of pantry raid that happened in kitchens all across America in the 1970s. Imagine this. You have a pound of ground beef, a half bag of corn chips, a can of tomatoes, and that lonely packet of taco seasoning tucked away in the cupboard. What do? You make dinner magic. This casserole was unapologetically crunchy, cheesy, and bold. You browned the beef with onions and taco seasoning, then layered it with crushed Fritos, cheese, and tomatoes. Some folks threw in a can of kidney beans, others swore by adding sour cream on top right before serving. No matter how you spun it, this dish was like a Tex-Mex lasagna dreamed up during a grocery store strike. It baked into a bubbling golden masterpiece that was equal parts nacho, taco, and weeknight savior. Parents swore by it for potlucks, and just like that, a new casserole classic was born. But if you think that is inventive, wait until you see how cabbage and beef teamed up to stretch every dollar without missing a beat. Cooking with onion soup mix was one of those mid-century hacks that made its way into countless beef recipes, and for good reason. The packets were cheap, shelf-stable, and packed with onion flavor that instantly transformed ground beef. Grandma would sprinkle it into meatloaf, burgers, or casseroles, and suddenly the dish tasted like it had been seasoned all day. The dried onion flakes added texture, while the seasoning mix brought a savory depth that was hard to achieve with just salt and pepper. For busy households, it was a shortcut that never felt like cheating, because the results were always so satisfying. Families grew used to the rich flavor it gave their meals, and the convenience meant it became a pantry staple in many homes. Today, with so many seasoning blends on the shelves, onion soup mix feels almost quaint, but it was once revolutionary in its simplicity. It proved that with a single packet, a plain pound of beef could be turned into something memorable. This trick was less about being fancy and more about being clever, and that's exactly why it became one of Grandma's sworn-by secrets. But if calico beans was the dish you brought to feed a crowd, skillet chili with crackers was the one you made alone. The solo supper that most people over 70 remember eating at least once a week without once calling it chili. You browned a small portion of ground beef, added onion, canned tomatoes, and chili powder, and let it simmer thin. Not thick like the kind you'd ladle over rice, but thin enough to pour over a stack of saltines laid flat in the bottom of a bowl. The crackers softened as you ate, absorbing the broth from below while the top layer stayed just dry enough to crunch. The ratio was everything. Too much liquid, and the crackers went to paste before you reached them. You calibrated it by eye, by the particular tilt of the pan over the bowl, and that calibration was never written anywhere. If you grew up eating it, the ratio lives in your wrist, nowhere else. Beef and cottage cheese loaf is a practical dish packed full of protein that was almost ideal for the lifestyle of the average American in the middle of the 20th century. It's not something you find anymore, but it was an ingenious way to stretch out your ground beef stock further while still making something delicious out of it. Plus, this is one of the few cases where you see what cheese can really do for a dish, besides just being a really nice topping. The moisture, texture, and nutritional value went up considerably thanks to the combination, and while it may seem pretty standard today, I mean, beef and cheese, really? It was actually something that was challenging norms back in the day. It made perfect sense when you placed it in the context of wartime rationing. Unlike a typical meatloaf, this used curds of cottage cheese to help keep the dish bonded together. It was a perfect meal for large families or people who were expecting more and more additions to theirs, and as you know, that was a lot of people back then. Hungarian hamburger bake brought a little old-world flair to the weeknight dinner table. This casserole took seasoned ground beef and paired it with wide egg noodles, paprika, sour cream, and cheese. You would layer everything into a baking dish, then bake it until the noodles were tender and the sauce was bubbling and golden on top. It was creamy, smoky, and deeply satisfying. The paprika added warmth without being too spicy, and the sour cream gave it that signature tangy richness. It was not exactly authentic Hungarian cuisine, but it borrowed enough to make you feel like you were eating something a little exotic. The recipe was especially popular in Midwestern kitchens, where Eastern European immigrant traditions were still alive and well. It was the kind of dish that made you feel cultured without straying too far from your comfort zone. Most of the ingredients came from cans, boxes, or the fridge, nothing fancy or hard to find, and that was the whole point. Number 15. Canned roast beef over white bread. You opened a can of roast beef in gravy, heated it in a saucepan until the gravy bubbled, and poured the whole thing over 2 slices of plain white bread on a plate. The bread soaked up the gravy and went soft while the beef sat on top in thick, tender shreds. Some people added instant mashed potatoes on the side to catch the extra gravy. This was an open-face hot sandwich that diners used to serve for less than $1. When seniors made it at home with a can from the shelf, it cost even less. The bread turned translucent under the weight of the gravy, and you ate it with a fork and knife like you were sitting at a lunch counter downtown. The presentation was nothing. The taste was everything. There is a particular silence in a kitchen where only one person eats. The burner clicks on. The can opens. The plate goes down on the table across from an empty chair. Millions of seniors in this country eat alone every single night, and most of them stopped cooking real meals years ago. Not because they forgot how, because cooking for one feels like a confession that nobody is coming. But the ones who kept opening those cans, who kept heating the skillet, who kept setting a place at the table even when the other chair stayed empty, they understood something that the rest of us are still learning. Feeding yourself is not giving up. Feeding yourself is the last act of refusing to. Picadillo brought Latin American flavors to American tables through generations of immigrant cooks who adapted their family recipes. Ground beef was browned with onions, garlic, and green peppers, then combined with tomatoes, olives, raisins, and spices that created a sweet, savory balance unlike typical American cooking. The mixture simmered until the flavors melded and the sauce thickened around the meat. Served over rice or stuffed into tortillas, picadillo was a complete meal that introduced seniors to new flavor combinations while remaining affordable. The raisins added unexpected sweetness that balanced the briny olives, creating complexity from simple ingredients. For seniors living in communities with Latin American neighbors, this dish often arrived as a gift from friends who wanted to share their heritage. The recipe spread through word of mouth and handwritten cards exchanged between women who understood that food built bridges. Picadillo proved that budget cooking could be adventurous without being intimidating. Skillet beef and cabbage was the one-pan meal that immigrant families brought from the old country and adapted to American kitchens. Ground beef was browned with onions in a large skillet, then shredded cabbage was piled on top and covered to steam until wilted. Caraway seeds, salt, and pepper were the only seasonings needed to transform these humble ingredients. The cabbage absorbed the beefy drippings as it cooked down, becoming silky and sweet while the meat stayed savory beneath. One head of cabbage and a pound of beef fed 6 people a complete meal without any side dishes needed. Grandmothers made this when money was tight and gardens or markets offered cheap cabbage. The dish came together quickly and required only one pan to wash afterward. Children who resisted vegetables somehow ate cabbage prepared this way without complaint. It was the cooking of necessity that became the cooking of comfort, passed down through families who never forgot where they came from. Hamburger spoon bread casserole was the Southern kitchen's answer to how to make 1 pound of ground beef feel like a full table. Spoon bread itself, a loose, custard-like cornmeal dish baked until it puffed and set, too soft to cut, served with a spoon, had been part of Southern cooking since before the Civil War. Sometime in the 1940s, some practical cook figured out that spreading seasoned ground beef in the bottom of the baking dish before pouring the batter on top produced something better than either dish alone. The beef released its fat upward into the batter as it baked. The batter absorbed it and held it. And what came out of the oven was a cornmeal crust that tasted like it had been cooked in the pan with the meat because it had been. Scooped onto a plate, the 2 layers separated naturally, browned meat underneath, soft golden crust above. And the whole thing needed nothing else. The hamburger version that made spoon bread a weeknight staple has largely vanished, the way the thriftiest versions of everything always vanish first. Before fondue became a punchline about 1970s dinner parties, it was a genuine cultural phenomenon, and ground beef played a bigger role than most people remember. The Better Homes and Gardens, Fondue and Tabletop Cooking book, reprinted 9 times by 1972, included recipes for fondue bourguignon that called for cubed steak, but budget-conscious hosts quickly adapted the concept for ground beef. They shaped seasoned hamburger into small, tight balls, barely bigger than a marble, and set them beside the pot of hot oil for guests to spear with long forks and cook tableside. The sizzle and pop of each meatball hitting the oil was half the entertainment. Dipping sauces lined the table, horseradish cream, cocktail sauce, mustard, and something called zippy sauce that seemed to appear in every fondue recipe of the era. The whole production turned a pound of ground beef into an evening of entertainment. Fondue sets were the wedding gift of the decade, and for a brief, glorious stretch of the early 70s, cooking your own dinner at the table felt like the height of sophistication. In Cuban-American kitchens from Miami's Calle Ocho to Union City, New Jersey, ground beef and turnip hash was born in farmhouse kitchens, where turnips were as plentiful as potatoes and just as important. When meat was scarce, women would dice the turnips fine, brown them with onions, and stir in a bit of ground beef for flavor. The turnips softened but kept a slight bite, their peppery taste blending beautifully with the savory meat. Everything cooked together in a skillet until golden and fragrant. It was the taste of thrift, of stretching what the land gave until it lasted through winter. Served hot with a fried egg or a slice of bread, it was a meal that required little but gave plenty. Farmers came in from the fields to eat it, grateful for its warmth and weight. It was not fancy, but it carried the flavor of resilience, the reminder that the simplest foods are often the most honest. Beef and cabbage skillet was not flashy, but it was reliable, and back in the post-war days, that counted for a lot. This dish came from the same logic that made Victory Garden's bloom and ration stamps necessary. Make the most of what you have. Cabbage was cheap, hearty, and available year-round. Ground beef, when you could get it, was used sparingly. So together, they made a meal that could stretch across a week if needed. The process was simple. Brown the beef, toss in shredded or chopped cabbage, season with whatever you had, salt, pepper, vinegar, maybe a splash of soy sauce or tomato paste if you were lucky. The cabbage softened into ribbons, soaking up every bit of beefy flavor while adding its own earthy goodness. You ate it straight from the skillet, hot and steaming, with maybe a hunk of bread on the side. It was survival food that did not taste like sacrifice. And if that sounds hearty enough, just wait until we take this same idea to the great outdoors with foil, fire, and a little campfire nostalgia. Mixing in stale bread soaked in milk was one of those Depression-era tricks that turned necessity into brilliance. Instead of wasting old bread, Grandma would soften the slices in milk until they were almost mush, then fold them straight into ground beef. This gave the meat extra volume and body, while the milk kept it tender and juicy. It was a way to bulk up meatloaf, burgers, and patties without making them dry or heavy, and no one at the table felt like they were eating less meat. The bread simply disappeared into the mixture, leaving behind a moist, flavorful dish that stretched further than a pound should. This practice also reflected a mindset where nothing went to waste and every scrap was valuable. Today we might see it as a quaint old trick, but back then it was survival and comfort in one. It made meals not only possible but memorable, because they were built out of creativity as much as ingredients. With this method, Grandma could take what might have been thrown away and transform it into something hearty, filling, and deeply satisfying, a true testament to the resourcefulness of kitchens from that era. Joe's Special came from San Francisco, from the restaurant district around Lower Broadway, where sometime in the 1940s, a late-night cook combined what was left in the kitchen. Ground beef, fresh spinach, and eggs scrambled together in a hot pan until the eggs just set and the spinach had wilted to almost nothing. That was the dish. No sauce, no starch, no binder. The trick was the heat, high enough that the beef stayed in small, distinct pieces rather than compressing into a mass, and fast enough that the eggs didn't dry out before everything came together. If you'd never made it, the timing felt like guessing. If you'd made it 20 times, it lived in your hands. You could feel the moment the eggs went from wet to just set without looking at the pan. Working man's food that happened to require a cook's instincts. That combination is exactly why it disappeared when the cook who knew the timing was gone. Savory beefcake is a lot lesser known, but its significance in history can't be understated. This is also one of the few items we have that actually dates back to the Victorian era. Back then, meat-based puddings were all the rage alongside sweat cakes. These were really dense cakes that were filled to the brim with protein. They had shredded beef, eggs, ground beef, and sweat or lard, and it made for a very dense, compact loaf, and some versions decided to take it up a few notches more. They would throw in warm spices, gravy, and mushroom stock, give this dish an earthy umami flavor with some sweet undertones. It was particularly beloved in rural households and working-class families simply because it was extremely hard to finish. Not because the dish tasted bad or anything, but it was just that filling. Savory beefcake declined by the 20th century because most people were starting to focus on lighter dishes, but for long journeys where you need something that really fills you up, sweet sour ground beef with pineapple was not subtle, but that is what made it shine. It was a stovetop dish you cooked in one big skillet. Ground beef browned with onions, then simmered in a mixture of pineapple chunks, vinegar, ketchup, and brown sugar. It smelled like takeout, it tasted like a tropical potluck, and it felt like a vacation, even when dinner was just in your tiny kitchen with the window cracked open. The sweetness from the pineapple and sugar mixed with the tang of vinegar to give the beef a punchy, bold flavor that clung to every grain of rice. This was the kind of dish that made kids ask for seconds, even if they did not love onions or peppers. You could find it in cookbooks from the 1960s and 1970s, usually in a section called International Flair or Creative Ground Beef Dinners. It was experimental, but not in a bad way. This dish was about making something exciting with what you had. Canned pineapple, cheap beef, sugar from the pantry. That was it. Yet somehow it came together like magic. Dishes like this reminded people that food could be fun, even when times were not. Number 14. Corned beef and cabbage. You did not need the whole brisket and the all-day boil. You needed a can of corned beef and half a head of cabbage. Sliced the cabbage into thick wedges, boiled them in salted water until they went soft, and then crumbled the canned corned beef into the pot for the last 5 minutes so it heated through and broke apart into the cabbage. Drained most of the water, added a knob of butter and some black pepper, and served it in a bowl. This was the version that Irish and Eastern European families on the East Coast made when the real thing was out of reach. The canned corned beef was saltier and denser than the fresh cut, but it worked. It always worked. The cabbage softened into something sweet and almost silky, and the beef gave it enough salt and fat to feel like a proper meal. A head of cabbage cost almost nothing. A can of corned beef was a couple of dollars at most. Together, they fed 3 or 4 people with leftovers for the next day. You could eat it again the next night cold, straight from the refrigerator, and it tasted even better because the salt had worked its way deeper into the cabbage overnight. Seniors who grew up in row houses in Philadelphia and Baltimore and Boston ate this once a week as children and never stopped making it. Their mothers made it on paydays. Their grandmothers made it on any day. The recipe never changed because it never needed to. 1 can, half a cabbage, a pot of water, and enough patience to let it simmer. The taste was home. The price was survival. And the smell, that sweet, salty, cabbagey steam filling a small kitchen, was a signal to everyone in the house that dinner was ready and that someone still cared enough to make it. Beef and bean burritos turned ground beef into handheld meals that were easy to prepare and even easier to reheat. Ground beef was seasoned with cumin, chili powder, and garlic, then combined with refried beans and wrapped in flour tortillas with cheese and whatever toppings were available. The burritos could be eaten immediately or wrapped in foil and frozen for later, providing seniors with ready-made meals that required only reheating. For those cooking alone, a single batch yielded enough burritos for an entire week of quick lunches or dinners. The combination of beans and beef created complete protein, while the tortilla provided convenient portability. Seniors could customize each burrito to their preferences. More cheese for some, extra beans for others, a splash of hot sauce for those who liked heat. The recipe required no special equipment or techniques, just basic seasoning and the willingness to roll. Burritos represented the kind of practical, adaptable cooking that kept seniors fed without fuss or complication. Beef and tomato macaroni was the stripped-down version of American chop suey that required even fewer ingredients. Ground beef was browned in a skillet, Then cooked macaroni and canned tomatoes were stirred in with salt, pepper, and a pinch of sugar to balance the acidity. The mixture simmered until the tomatoes broke down and coated everything in a simple, satisfying sauce. No celery, no peppers, no fancy seasonings. Just beef, pasta, and tomatoes the way grandmothers made it when the pantry held nothing else. This was the meal of truly lean times, when stretching ingredients meant survival. 1 pound of beef, 1 box of macaroni, and 1 can of tomatoes fed a family without complaint. Children ate it without knowing how little it cost, just that it tasted like home and love and warmth. The dish required no recipe because there was nothing to measure, just proportions learned by watching. It was poverty cooking that somehow tasted like abundance. Burger bundles were the 1960s dinner party trick, and the trick was this. You pressed a cavity into a large raw meatball, packed in a scoop of boxed stuffing, Pepperidge Farm if you had it, sealed the beef back around it, and presented what looked like an oversized meatball but opened at the table to reveal a bread-stuffed interior nobody had seen coming. Women's magazines and covered dish supper circuits ran the recipe through the mid-60s because the reveal at the table, cutting into something ordinary and finding something unexpected inside, created exactly the kind of conversation that kept guests talking. The stuffing absorbed the beef juices as everything baked, the exterior browned and held its shape, and the moment someone cut one open and asked what was in it, the cook had the answer and the room. It was a dish with a sense of humor built into its construction. Nobody makes them now, partly because the dinner party itself has largely gone the way of the bundles. Swedish meatball. Noodle bake turned the beloved cocktail party appetizer into a proper weeknight casserole, and dinner tables across the early 1970s were better for it. The meatballs themselves were seasoned with a touch of nutmeg and allspice, the Scandinavian signature that distinguished them from every other ground beef ball, then browned in butter and nestled into a baking dish over cooked egg noodles. The sauce was the heart of the thing. Cream of mushroom soup thinned with sour cream and a splash of beef broth, poured over everything before the dish went into the oven at 350 degrees for 30 minutes. The noodles absorbed the creamy gravy while the meatballs stayed tender under a bubbling surface. Women's Circle magazine and Family Circle both featured versions in the early 70s, and the recipe became a staple of the card file collections that every home cook kept in a little tin box on the counter. It sat at the crossroads of comfort and elegance, casual enough for Tuesday, impressive enough for company. The wobble was the first thing you noticed, a faint, gelatinous shimmer when the platter hit the table that told you this was not ordinary meatloaf. Number 15. Ground beef hash brown casserole. You pressed a layer of frozen shredded hash browns into a buttered baking dish, spread browned and seasoned ground beef over the top, poured a mixture of cream of mushroom soup and sour cream over everything, and covered it with shredded cheddar. 45 minutes covered, 15 uncovered to brown the cheese. The hash browns on the bottom crisped against the hot glass, while the ones in the middle soaked up the soup and turned creamy. One dish, one oven, and dinner for 6 without a single complaint about what was for supper. The frozen hash browns were the shortcut that made it possible on a weeknight, and nobody judged you for it because everybody used them. Cabbage and apple skillet was the unexpected pairing that somehow made perfect sense. Sliced apples softened alongside shreds of cabbage in a cast-iron pan, their sweetness blending with a touch of vinegar and the salt of whatever meat was available, often bacon ends or bits of beef. The result was a balance of tart and savory, sweet and smoky. It filled the home with a smell both sharp and comforting, like the promise of something good on a lean day. This dish belonged to families who used what they had, turning orchard fruit and garden cabbage into something memorable. Served alongside bread or potatoes, it brought a little color and cheer to the gray months of winter. Cabbage and apple skillet was not just food. It was proof that frugality could still taste like care, and that even hardship had room for warmth. Campfire foil packets were 1 part meal and 1 part memory. If you ever went to a summer scout camp or had a backyard cookout in the 1960s or 1970s, chances are you have made one of these. It started with a square of foil and a sense of adventure. You piled on raw ground beef, thin sliced potatoes, carrot coins, and slivers of onion. A little salt, a little pepper, maybe some garlic powder or ketchup if you were living fancy. Then you folded it all up, sealed it tight, and tossed it into the coals, or the oven if you were indoors. What came out 20 or 30 minutes later was something far greater than the sum of its parts. Some families added Worcestershire sauce or a pat of butter before sealing it. Others just kept it simple. But either way, it was delicious. It was also fun. There was something magical about unwrapping your own little packet and digging in with a fork. But if you wanted your beef with a bit more spice and southern flair, the next dish brought jambalaya right into casserole territory. Doubling portions with cabbage was one of those clever ideas that made a little beef feel like a feast. By shredding cabbage thin and frying it right alongside the ground beef, Grandma turned 1 modest pound of meat into a skillet, brimming with flavor and substance. The cabbage absorbed the drippings, carrying the richness of the beef into every bite, while adding bulk that made plates look generous and complete. What could have been a small meal suddenly became a dish that felt abundant, filling the house with the smell of comfort as it simmered away. This trick also worked quietly to add vegetables into family meals, making them more balanced without anyone noticing. For children, it was simply dinner, but for adults, it was a careful solution to tight budgets. The sizzling pan of beef and cabbage often became the centerpiece of the table, warm and steaming with pride. Even today, beef and cabbage together carry a sense of hominess, proving that resourcefulness was just as powerful as extravagance when it came to feeding a family well. Beef spoon-bread casserole arrived at the table looking like something between cornbread and a soufflé. Dense enough to stand on its own, soft enough to eat with a spoon. You browned ground beef with onion, seasoned it simply, and poured it into the bottom of a greased baking dish. Over the top went a batter of cornmeal, milk, eggs, and a small amount of butter stirred together until smooth, which set up around the beef during baking into something halfway between a custard and a firm bread. The distinction between spoon bread and cornbread was the eggs. The eggs gave it lift and a custardy interior that a dry batter could never produce. And knowing when to add them without deflating the whole thing was knowledge that lived in the hands, not on a card. Appalachian and Deep South kitchens had kept spoon bread alive since before the Civil War. The version with ground beef folded into the base was the Depression-era adaptation that turned a side dish into a complete supper. It stopped appearing as stovetop convenience took over, and the slow oven became something nobody had time for. If you think about it, pickled beef balls were really just as old-fashioned. They were born out of a preservation technique that basically combined chopped beef with vinegar, salt, and some spices that were then cured in a briny liquid. This was done so that the meat would last a lot longer than it usually could, and it was likely something that came out of pickled meat traditions stemming from Europe. German Sauerfleisch and the Jewish dish pickled tongue have some pretty strong resemblance to this dish. The acidity of the vinegar would do more than just preserve the meat. It would also be wonderful at tenderizing the meat so that you could actually use cheaper cuts of meat. Most rural families could not afford premium cuts because of how expensive they were, but nobody really liked eating chewy, tough, rubber-like meat. These pickled beef balls were an easy solution, and one that you could make in a batch for a rainy day. Cabbage and beef layer bake was what happened when stuffed cabbage rolls felt like too much effort. Instead of rolling individual leaves, you just chopped the cabbage, browned the beef, and layered everything like a lazy lasagna. Then you poured over tomato sauce and baked it until the whole thing melted into itself. It was tangy, savory, and just the right amount of messy. The breadcrumbs on top gave it crunch, while the cabbage softened underneath like a blanket. This was old country cooking, without the fuss. You could stretch 1 pound of ground beef with half a head of cabbage and still feed 6 people. No special tools, no exotic spices, just tomato, meat, cabbage, and thyme. This bake was especially popular in towns with strong Polish or Russian immigrant roots. It showed up at potlucks, family gatherings, and Tuesday night dinners that needed to be warm and reliable. Sometimes it had rice mixed in, sometimes it had cheese, Either way, it filled the house with a smell that felt like home. You did not need to plate it pretty. Just scoop it, serve it, and eat. Number 13. Canned beef chow mein. La Choy sold it in a tall can with a separate, smaller can of crispy noodles banded to the side. You heated the chow mein in a skillet, poured it over the crunchy noodles on a plate, and ate it with a fork. The vegetables were soft and the beef was cut thin, almost shaved, floating in a sauce that tasted like soy and celery and something faintly sweet. It was not Chinese food. Nobody pretended it was. But it was hot, and it was different from everything else on the shelf. And on a night when you could not face another plate of the same 3 things you had been eating all week, that difference was worth the price of the can. Seniors bought it because it required no additions, no sides, and no decisions. Open, heat, eat. The crunchy noodles on top made it feel like a real meal instead of something poured from a can, even though that is exactly what it was. Hamburger vegetable bake layered ground beef with whatever vegetables the refrigerator held, creating a flexible casserole that never tasted the same way twice. Ground beef was crumbled raw into a baking dish, then covered with sliced potatoes, carrots, onions, and green beans, any combination that needed using before it spoiled. Canned tomato soup diluted with water was poured over everything. The dish was covered, and it baked until the meat cooked through and vegetables softened. For seniors, this casserole solved the problem of produce wilting in the crisper drawer. Nothing went to waste when everything could be layered into the bake. The tomato soup created sauce while the vegetables released their own moisture, keeping everything tender and flavorful. One casserole provided multiple meals without requiring precise recipes or expensive ingredients. The dish taught practical lessons about using what you had rather than following rigid instructions. This was survival cooking elevated to comfort. Depression meat pie was the covered dish casserole that carried families through the hardest years. Ground beef was browned and stretched with oatmeal or breadcrumbs, seasoned with onion and whatever herbs were available, then spread in a baking dish. A simple pie crust made from flour, lard, and water covered the top, sealing in the filling before everything baked until golden. The crust turned flaky while the filling stayed moist, each slice revealing the clever stretching that made a little meat go far. Grandmothers made this during the 1930s and kept making it through the war years and beyond. The recipe required no measuring, just hands that knew how much flour to add and eyes that recognized when the crust looked right. Families gathered around tables to eat this pie with gratitude for having food at all. It represented survival and hope during impossible times. The dish has nearly vanished from modern kitchens, but it deserves remembering. She started it the night before. Always the night before. The beef went into a heavy pot with onion, canned tomatoes, and whatever vegetables needed using, corn, peas, green beans, and simmered until the broth reduced into the kind of gravy that coated the back of a spoon. In the morning, she poured it cold into the baking dish and left it in the icebox until an hour before supper, then mixed the biscuit dough by hand and dropped it in spoonfuls across the top. What came out was not a pot pie. The crust was too rough for that, too honest, and not a stew, though the filling ran when you served it. The biscuit dough baked over beef gravy made the kind of supper that required a bowl, not a plate, and a spoon wide enough to get biscuit and filling in the same bite. She knew that. She always knew that. Jellied hamburger loaf belonged to the mid-century gelatin craze, and while the trend peaked in the 1950s and 1960s, versions still appeared in Good Housekeeping and community cookbooks well into the early 1970s. The method called for cooking a seasoned ground beef mixture, then packing it into a loaf pan with dissolved, unflavored gelatin stirred into the meat juices. Chilled overnight, the loaf sliced cleanly, each piece holding its shape on the plate with a smooth, glossy surface that regular meatloaf could never achieve. Cold sliced hamburger loaf served on lettuce leaves with mustard and pickles became a summer supper solution when nobody wanted to heat up the kitchen. It stored beautifully, lasted days in the refrigerator, and traveled to picnics without falling apart. Number 11. Beef barbecue cups. You browned ground beef, stirred in barbecue sauce, a little brown sugar, and a tablespoon of vinegar. Then you pressed rounds of canned biscuit dough into greased muffin tins, spooned the beef mixture in, and topped each one with shredded cheddar. 12 minutes at 400 degrees and you had a dozen little cups with a golden shell and a saucy beef center. These showed up at school fundraisers, scout meetings, and weeknight suppers when time was short and mouths were many. Finger food made from pantry staples, and every kid who ate one asked for 2 more. A dozen of these used half a pound of beef, which meant you could stretch a single package into 2 batches and still have sauce left over. Ground beef and cabbage gravy over bread was the meal you made when there was almost nothing left, and somehow it still tasted like kindness. Ground beef browned with onions and cabbage made a quick, rich gravy thickened with flour and broth. It was spooned over day-old bread or toast, soaking in until it became soft and savory. The first bite warmed the chest. The second reminded you that a meal could still feel generous even when it was not. Families called it poor man's stew, but there was dignity in its making. The cabbage stretched the meat, the bread caught every drop of flavor, and together they became something greater than the sum of their parts. It was not about indulgence. It was about care and making sure everyone got their share. Beef jambalaya bake took everything you loved about Louisiana comfort food and gave it a weeknight twist. Traditional jambalaya was made with shrimp or sausage, but when ground beef was what you had, you did not complain, you improvised. This casserole was warm, spicy, and overflowing with flavor. You would start by browning the beef in a skillet with onions, bell peppers, and celery, the Cajun holy trinity. Toss in some garlic, tomato paste, and a good shake of paprika or cayenne pepper, and suddenly, the whole house smelled like dinner was about to get exciting. Then came the rice, which cooked in the pan with beef broth or tomato juice until everything swelled and soaked up the seasoning. Some families added beans or corn. Others threw cheese on top and baked it for an extra kick. It was the kind of dish that got passed around the table fast and left nothing behind but crumbs. And if you think baking jambalaya was clever, just wait until you see what happens when you stuff a hamburger inside an onion. No bun required. Using tomato soup as sauce was one of Grandma's simplest but most dependable shortcuts for flavor. With a single can of condensed tomato soup, she could take plain ground beef and transform it into a meal that was hearty, tangy, and comforting. The soup added moisture, preventing casseroles, skillet suppers, or even simple beef and rice dishes from becoming dry or bland. Its sweet, slightly tart taste gave the meal a richness that stuck in memory, tying dishes to the familiar red and white cans stacked in cupboards across America. Families grew up with that signature flavor, recognizing it immediately as the taste of comfort. For Grandma, it wasn't about cutting corners, but about using what she had wisely, and tomato soup was a pantry item that always delivered. With 1 can and a pound of beef, she could have a hot dinner ready that satisfied everyone at the table. Today, the trick feels nostalgic, but back then it was a piece of kitchen magic built out of practicality and care. Ground beef and potato hash was the morning after dish, the one that got made with what the previous night had left behind. You started the diced potatoes in hot fat first, giving them a 5-minute head start, then added the ground beef alongside. The whole thing cooked in the cast iron skillet over medium-high heat without a lid. You wanted the moisture to cook off, not steam, pressing everything flat periodically and then leaving it alone long enough for a crust to form before you broke it up and pressed it flat again. The crust was the point. Without it, you had a scramble. With it, you had hash. She knew the difference by sound. The sizzle changed when the crust was forming, went quieter and more even, and that was when you left it alone. A stove teaches you that. You can't learn it anywhere else. Meat potato candy is a very strange dish. It's incredibly practical, it's very economical, and it comes out of a time where those two things were all that people wanted in their food. It's something we can thank the Depression and wartime periods for. It was back then that families were stretching things and making nutrient-dense treats out of literally whatever they could find, barter or grow. The dish was something that took some American classics and put them together very nicely. You had mashed potatoes, ground beef, which was usually pork or beef, but even bologna would do, and then you had sugar. Sometimes people would spare a bit of flour so that this could be binded properly. Now most people would also prefer their candy to be like a typical toffee, but times were tough. The idea behind the candy was more practical than it was fun anyway. This time, people thought that they would make a calorically dense dish that would be easy to carry around in their pockets and bags instead of needing separate storage. It would also be high in energy, so it would be like an instant pick-me-up. In that regard, I think they did pretty great. Would you use it the same way at work? Ground beef and peanut butter stew sounds like a dare, but it was actually a smart Depression-era solution that made a quiet return during the 1960s. You browned ground beef with onions, added canned tomatoes, and stirred in a big spoonful of peanut butter. That was it. Somehow, it worked. The peanut butter melted into the stew, giving it a nutty richness and silky texture that made it taste like something much fancier. You could serve it over rice or eat it with bread. Either way, it was filling, affordable, and shockingly good. It came from the tradition of using pantry staples to bulk up basic meals, especially when meat was scarce. Peanut butter added protein, calories, and a hint of sweetness that made the tomato stew feel like something more. Some recipes added beans or chili powder, others kept it simple. This stew was rarely written in official cookbooks. It was passed down through word of mouth or scribbled in the back pages of community newsletters. But for those who remembered it, it was unforgettable. It was the kind of recipe that taught you how to be bold, even in a tiny kitchen. Number 12. Treat and macaroni skillet. Treat was the other luncheon meat, the one that sat on the shelf next to Spam but cost a few cents less. You cubed it, fried it until the edges crisped, and tossed it with cooked elbow macaroni and a squeeze of ketchup or a splash of canned tomato sauce. The whole skillet came together in about 12 minutes. No oven, no baking dish, no waiting. Treat had a softer texture than Spam, almost like a firm pate, and it browned differently, more golden than crispy. Paired with macaroni, it made a one-pan dinner that required exactly 0 skill and generated exactly 1 dirty dish. Seniors on tight budgets bought Treat specifically because those few pennies mattered when you were counting every coin at the register. Meatball sub casserole captured all the flavors of the classic sandwich in a form that was easier to prepare and serve. Ground beef was mixed with Italian seasonings shaped into small meatballs and browned until crusty on the outside. The meatballs were nestled into a baking dish, covered with marinara sauce and mozzarella cheese, then baked until bubbling and golden. Sliced hoagie rolls were served alongside for building individual sandwiches or soaking up the sauce. For seniors who remembered grabbing meatball subs from neighborhood delis, this casserole brought back those flavors without requiring a trip out. The meatballs stayed tender under their blanket of cheese while the sauce grew rich in the oven's heat. One casserole provided multiple meals, each serving as satisfying as visiting the deli, but far more economical. The recipe proved that beloved flavors could be adapted for home cooking. Another staple of our United States cuisine, beef and bean chili. Ooh, my grandma knew how to make that chili right. This wasn't the watery, mild stuff you might get from a can. No, this was a thick, hearty, beef and bean-packed chili that stuck to your ribs and made you forget about the cold weather outside. Ground beef, kidney beans, tomatoes, and a fiery blend of spices. Grandma's secret weapon was always a dash of chili powder and maybe a little cocoa powder if she was feeling fancy. Simmered to perfection, the rich, meaty sauce soaked into every bite. And the beans? Well, they weren't just filler. They added a creamy texture that balanced the beefy goodness. Whether served with cornbread, crackers, or just a dollop of sour cream on top, Grandma's chili could warm even the coldest of souls. Now, you might have noticed how I'm trying to avoid mentioning the origins of chili. And if you're from the south of the United States, you probably know why. Chili has roots in the American Southwest, but variations can be found all over the country. Some swear by no beans, which may come as a shocker, I know, but at Grandma's beans were a must. They made the chili stretch further, which meant more leftovers, because the only thing better than chili is day-old chili. Long before the biscuit cobbler came down from the stove, a different kind of ground beef was being pressed thin in the Mississippi Hill Country. And while the name was not designed to attract customers, the price was. The slug burger was born in Corinth, Mississippi during the Depression. A 5-cent fried patty of ground beef stretched with soy flour, pressed thin as a pancake, and dropped into a cast-iron skillet of hot lard until the edges went crisp and the interior stayed just tender. The soy flour created a crust that plain beef couldn't match, thin, crispy-edged, slightly chewy at the center. 5 cents bought a sandwich with pickles and mustard, and along that stretch of Highway 72 through the 30s and 40s, it bought you a meal when nothing else was affordable. The technique of stretching beef with soy flour was common across the Depression South, but Corinth made it a local institution. The city has held an annual slug burger festival since 1988. The patty still served at local diners the way it was during the Depression, with pickles, mustard, and a bun. It is the only burger in America named for its own price. In the border towns of Texas and the barrios of Southern California, enchiladas had always been rolled by hand with care and patience. But suburban America in the early 1970s wanted the flavor without the fuss. Beef Enchilada Bake answered that call by layering corn tortillas with seasoned ground beef, canned enchilada sauce, and shredded cheddar in a casserole dish, no rolling required. Old El Paso had introduced canned enchilada sauce in the 1960s, and by the 70s it was a supermarket staple that made Tex-Mex accessible to cooks who had never heard of a comel. The casserole went into the oven until the cheese melted into a golden crust and the tortillas softened into the sauce, creating layers that pulled apart like savory lasagna. Topped with sour cream, sliced black olives, and shredded iceberg lettuce, it became a Friday night staple in households from Phoenix to Peoria. The dish bridged two culinary worlds, authentic enough to satisfy anyone who knew real enchiladas, easy enough for cooks who were just discovering them. Number 10. Mexican cornbread casserole. You poured half a batch of cornbread batter into a greased skillet, spread a layer of browned and seasoned ground beef mixed with canned chili beans and diced green chilies over it, then topped with the rest of the batter and a blanket of shredded cheese. 30 minutes in the oven and the cornbread baked around the filling like a savory cake. When you cut into it, the layers held together, beef in the middle, golden bread on top and bottom. One skillet, one oven, no side dishes necessary. The green chilies gave it just enough heat to warm your chest without making the kids reach for a glass of milk. The grocery store in the 1970s did not look like it does today. There were no organic labels, no grass-fed sections, no meal kits wrapped in plastic. There was a meat counter, a produce aisle, and a wall of canned goods. Ground beef sat behind the glass in red and white trays, and the butcher knew your name if you came in every week. A family did not choose between brands of ground beef. They chose between regular and lean, and most of them chose regular because it was cheaper, and the fat was what made everything taste good. That simplicity was a kind of freedom. You did not need a recipe app or a grocery delivery service. You needed a pound of beef, a can of something, and a hot oven. Beef and vegetable. Kitchen sink stew was exactly what its name promised. Everything but the kitchen sink. It began with ground beef or scraps of leftover roast, followed by whatever vegetables still lingered in the root cellar, carrots, parsnips, turnips, onions, or even cabbage. The pot simmered slowly, the broth growing darker and richer as hours passed. No two batches ever tasted the same because no two kitchens had the same ingredients. It was the definition of resourcefulness, a stew built from odds and ends that might have otherwise gone to waste. Sometimes barley was added to thicken it, or a splash of vinegar to sharpen the flavor. It was a meal of invention, of pride in using every scrap. When families gathered around that steaming pot, they were not just eating, they were honoring the art of survival made delicious. The stew could feed a family for days, each reheating, deepening its flavor. It was never fancy, but it was deeply personal, a record of what the week had been and what was left to carry forward. Every spoonful told a quiet story of thrift, care, and endurance, reminding those who ate it that home was not measured by plenty, but by how you made do with what you had. Bunless stuffed onion burgers were like something straight out of a low-carb fever dream, but in the 1970s they were downright trendy. Back then, people were starting to think more about their diets, less bread, more vegetables, that sort of thing, but they were not about to give up ground beef. So, someone had the brilliant idea to turn onions into edible burger buns. Here is how it went. You hollowed out a whole onion, filled the center with seasoned ground beef, sometimes mixed with breadcrumbs, cheese, or egg, then sealed it up and baked it in the oven until the onion softened and the beef cooked through. The outside got golden and sweet, the inside juicy and rich. Sometimes a little tomato sauce or barbecue glaze was poured over the top, making it look fancy enough for company, but still easy enough to make on a Wednesday night. It was strange, it was bold, and it worked. These burgers were filling, full of flavor, and just different enough to be exciting. And if you thought stuffed onions were the height of beefy comfort, wait until you see what happened when mashed potatoes got paired with gravy thick enough to stand a spoon in. Pre-browning beef before casseroles was one of those small steps that changed the entire character of a dish. Grandma knew that tossing raw beef straight into a bake would leave it greasy, uneven, and heavy. By frying it first, carefully draining the fat, and sometimes seasoning it in the skillet, she created a clean, flavorful base. This simple act gave casseroles a deeper, richer taste, while also keeping the texture balanced so the final dish wasn't soggy or mushy. When paired with pasta, rice, or vegetables, that first step of browning ensured harmony among all the ingredients. Families grew used to casseroles that were hearty but never overwhelming, because technique mattered as much as thrift. It showed that skill in cooking didn't have to be elaborate. It was about respecting each step. Today, many recipes still include this instruction, though people sometimes skip it, forgetting why it mattered. Back then, it was common sense, part of the rhythm of daily cooking, a habit that quietly shaped meals we still remember fondly. The Midwest double-crust meat pie was the dish that required time nobody felt they had anymore, which is exactly how it disappeared. You made a proper pastry, shortening cut into flour with cold water added a spoonful at a time, and rolled it out twice. Between the crusts went browned ground beef, cooked with diced carrots, onion, and potato, seasoned with Worcestershire and bound with a thin flour and broth gravy. The top crust went on, crimped at the edges, cut with a vent, and it baked until the pastry was golden and the filling bubbled. British and Scots-Irish immigrant families brought the double-crust meat pie to the Midwest in the 19th century. By the 1940s, it appeared in community church cookbooks from Iowa to Ohio as a standard Sunday supper dish. She made it for Christmas Eve, every year, without fail, until she couldn't. Nobody has made it for Christmas Eve since. Bologna burger bakes were actually a part of mid-century home economics creativity. It was thanks to the advent of processed food becoming such a widespread thing. Bologna, Spam, and hot dogs were all incorporated into everyday meals in many different kinds of ways. This dish was something that involved thick rounds of bologna, and it was mixed with all sorts of different kinds of seasonings. People particularly loved what paprika and bay leaves could do for the dish. They thought it added a spicy kick to the first few bites that dissolved very nicely. Once the dish had established itself as a powerhouse of the 1950s, it was slowly starting to become something you would see in dorms, in homes, parties, and just something your teenagers would be messing around with. It helped that it was such a nice and affordable source of protein, and that Bo Logan was already becoming perceived as a burger substitute. Ground beef was still expensive thanks to all the rationing, and home cooks thought that if they couldn't get that regularly, they may as well get to repurposing. Beef and barley bake was what happened when you wanted stew without the soup. You took ground beef, cooked it with onions, carrots, and sometimes celery, then stirred in pearl barley and baked the whole thing until thick, golden, and aromatic. It was a dish that felt old, like something from your grandmother's farmhouse kitchen. And maybe it was. Barley has been around longer than most grains, and during the 1960s and 1970s, it was one of those ingredients that made a quiet comeback thanks to its price and nutrition. This bake was earthy and dense, like a cross between stuffing and pot roast. You could season it with thyme or just keep it simple. It filled the house with the smell of comfort. It kept you full for hours, and it made even the cheapest cut of beef stretch a little farther. Sometimes you added a splash of tomato juice, sometimes just a pat of butter on top. It was a blank canvas, but a dependable one. You could make it ahead of time, freeze it, and reheat it without losing an ounce of flavor. It may not win beauty contests, but beef and barley bake always won dinner. Number 11. Canned turkey and gravy over rice. You heated the canned turkey and gravy together in a saucepan, stirring slowly until the gravy smoothed out and the turkey broke into soft, pale pieces. Spooned it over a mound of white rice and ate it with a fork. This tasted closer to a Thanksgiving leftover plate than anything else you could pull from a shelf in the middle of March. The canned gravy was thick and peppery, and the turkey, while softer than the roasted kind, carried enough savory depth to make the rice disappear one forkful at a time. A can of turkey and a cup of dry rice fed one person twice. You ate it hot the first night and cold the next morning straight from the container, standing at the counter before the coffee finished brewing. Sage-infused ground beef patties might sound like something you would find in a fancy restaurant today, but back then, it was just another stroke of pure homegrown genius. Sage was everywhere in the right parts of the country, and it did not cost a dime to pick some fresh sprigs. Mixed into ground beef with a little salt and a whole lot of care, the result was a smoky, savory patty that smelled so good cooking, you would swear it could make a grown man cry. Fried up in an old cast iron pan until the edges were crispy and the middle stayed juicy, these patties were tossed onto plates with a scoop of beans, maybe some fried potatoes if you were lucky. They were not just filling, they were soul-satisfying. And once you tasted beef lifted up by wild sage, you would wonder why anyone ever bothered with plain salt and pepper again. Speaking of dishes that hit you right in the comfort zone, the next one was a staple at tables that needed stretching a meal just a little bit farther. Crispy corn cakes. Stuffed with seasoned beef were one of those foods you could smell cooking before you even stepped into the event. Little golden discs sizzling in big iron skillets, stuffed to the brim with ground beef seasoned with paprika, onions, and a pinch of chili powder if you wanted to wake up your taste buds. The outside was crunchy and golden, the inside savory and juicy. It was a dance of textures that made you keep reaching for just one more. The trick was to keep the corn cakes thin enough that they crisped up, but thick enough to hold all that seasoned beef inside without falling apart. At powwows and fairs, you would see kids running around with one in each hand, faces smeared with beefy goodness, while the elders sat back and nodded approvingly. It was simple, it was satisfying, and it was the perfect food for big gatherings where nobody had time for forks and knives. And if you think crispy stuffed corn cakes sound irresistible, wait until you pull up a camp chair and hear about the kind of chili that made starry nights and crackling fires taste even better. In the 1960s, there was a rising demand for all sorts of experimentative casserole recipes. Hamburger biscuit pinwheel rolls lived in the intersection of clever and practical, and the kitchens that made them were the same ones that figured out nothing needed to go to waste if you thought about it carefully. Biscuit dough rolled flat, covered with seasoned ground beef and shredded cheese, then rolled up tight and sliced into rounds. The rounds going cut side down into a greased baking dish and baked until the biscuit puffed and the filling set inside each swirled slice. Pillsbury's refrigerated biscuit dough made this easier when it became widely available in the 1960s, which was when the dish spread beyond households that made their own biscuits. The trick was in the rolling. Too loose and the filling fell out during slicing. Too tight and the biscuit couldn't rise. The cook who'd made them 20 times knew exactly how firm to roll without thinking about it. The first-time cook always rolled too loose and served rounds with a beef and cheese crater instead of a swirl. Both tasted fine. Somebody at Pillsbury, or maybe it was a resourceful mother in Kansas City, figured out that if you flattened a refrigerated biscuit, wrapped it around a seasoned ground beef patty with a slice of American cheese, and baked the whole thing until golden, you had created a portable cheeseburger that children would eat without complaint. Cheeseburger stuffed biscuits appeared in the 1965 ground beef cookbook and carried right through the early 1970s as the kind of recipe that mothers clipped from magazines and taped inside kitchen cabinet doors. The biscuit dough puffed around the filling, sealing in the beef juices and melting the cheese into a gooey center. A dab of ketchup and mustard inside before sealing made them taste exactly like a drive-through burger wrapped in bread. They were perfect for packed lunches, after-school snacks, and those nights when sitting down for a formal dinner felt like too much to ask. Number 9. Hamburger stew. Not a soup, not a chili, but a thick stew with big chunks of potato, sliced carrots, diced onion, and crumbled ground beef simmered together in tomato juice seasoned with salt, pepper, and a bay leaf. You cooked it low and slow on the stovetop for about an hour until the potatoes started to break apart and thicken the liquid on their own. No flour, no roux, just the starch from the potatoes doing the work. A pot of this fed a family for 2 nights, and on the second night, it was better because the flavors had time to settle in. You reheated it slowly on the stove, never the microwave, and the broth had darkened and thickened overnight into something that clung to the spoon. Cabbage and bean soup was the workingman's dinner, a pot full of nourishment that cost next to nothing. Cabbage gave it sweetness, beans provided the protein, and a handful of spices made it taste like more than it was. Some used white beans. Others used pintos or lentils, whatever they had in their pantry. Everything simmered together until the beans were tender and the cabbage silky soft. The result was thick and hearty, perfect for dipping bread or biscuits. It was food that did not apologize for being simple because it had no reason to. It filled stomachs, warmed hands, and left no one hungry. It carried the faint sweetness of cabbage and the quiet depth of beans cooked slow. For many families, this was the meal that saw them through the hardest winters, proof that comfort did not have to be costly. A pot of cabbage and beans simmering on the stove was a sign that warmth still existed even when money did not. Sometimes a ham bone or spoonful of drippings was added to give it body. But even without, it tasted like care. It was humble food that made people feel seen, nourished, and safe, a reminder that generosity can live inside a single pot. These are 100 forgotten ground beef recipes from the 1960s that families once relied on and the world has let go. This one runs long, and every recipe is worth hearing. A pound of ground beef never asked for much. It needed a hot skillet, a little seasoning, and somebody who knew what to do with it. Those 100 recipes came from kitchens where nothing was complicated and everybody got fed. The fact that most of them have slipped out of everyday cooking does not mean they stopped being worth making. If this list brought back a meal your family used to sit down to, share this video with someone who remembers it the same way you do.